Welcome back to the podcast. We have Ellesmere back for the third time, and this is a highly requested episode. A lot of you actually been asking me, where's this episode for the start of season 2? I have to apologize because this is entirely on me. Start of the year has been busy. It took Ellesmere to come and remind me like, hey, when are we going to do this season 2 stuff? So apologies to you folks in Ellesmere, but here we are, recapping season 2, what you guys need to know, how to heal the hardest pulls. But Ellesmere, welcome back firstly, but any thoughts on the new season? How have you found the start to the season 2 of The War Within?
Thanks for having me, Quazii. And yeah, I'm loving season 2. It looks incredible. It's been very refreshing. So many of the changes by Blizzard have been really game-changing, both for the mental, for pugging. The dungeon pool is amazing. There are just so many great things about this season, and I see it as kind of like a fresh start for M+ compared to last season. So I'm really excited for that.
I definitely resonate with that. So you folks can already see I have MDT on my screen, and we'll dive into the most difficult pools very shortly. But I know there's a question that I need to ask, if not a lot of people will kind of shoot me, because Ellesmere, obviously known as, probably the best Holy Paladin in the world. I know recently you made a lot of very long tweets about the state of Holy Paladins. So I want to just take a couple minutes, understand where Holy Paladins are sitting before we dive into the dungeon breakdown, if you don't mind sharing.
Of course. I think Holy Pally gets a really bad rap because of how it's performed in Raid so far. And to an extent, that's fair. I do get that, throughput-wise, we're fairly low compared to other healers, but I also think that we're going to see some buffs hopefully today, because the Race to World First is over, and that's normally when Blizzard starts to do some tuning. So yes, Hpal is definitely in need of some throughput buffs, and yes, our playstyle in a few different areas is kind of rough. We still have a somewhat splintered tree where the devs aren't really sure if we want to go more of a caster route or more of a melee route. Obviously, I'm a fan of melee Hpal, but I know that there are a lot of people who are still kind of clinging to the caster playstyle, and so Blizzard's trying to keep that around. But in my opinion, Blizzard really needs to commit to either like really integrating caster in a better way, or just going with melee, one or the other, because this kind of in-between thing has splintered our class tree a lot, and or spec tree, and has made Hpal playstyle a little bit awkward. So I think that's kind of the first thing, is just like getting a clear direction for the spec. And I'm hoping that's something that we see come 11.1.5. But in the meantime, for now, in Raid, we're performing pretty low, but in M+, our healing profile is actually really strong, mainly because of our tier set. So our tier set allows Divine Toll to be a 30-second CD instead of a 45 one, assuming that you're building and spending quick enough, which means that the core talent that we play around in M+, Beacon of Virtue, we can actually get a Divine Toll cast every other Virtue instead of one every 3, and you can rotate that with Holy Prism. So every single Virtue you can either have Divine Toll or Holy Prism up for, which means that we just have huge burst healing every 15 seconds, which makes us really strong healing profile-wise in M+. Now, I do still think we need some throughput buffs, mostly for Raid, and there could be some playstyle things to work on, but in general, I'm actually loving Hpal in M+ this season, and I think that it's a lot of fun, way better than the first season of The War Within. So overall, I'd say, A tier and M+ for me, like in terms of playstyle and throughput. The only thing that we really could need work on is our damage throughput is pretty low compared to other healers. But yeah, I'm having a lot of fun. I think that it's way better than people say that it is in M+, and hopefully we get some throughput buffs to give us a little bit of love in Raid, so we feel better in there.
Right, we love to hear that. Great stuff. I would dive right into the dungeons now, because some of you folks on this podcast, if you're a long-time listener, you know the last time around we went 2.5 hours with Ellesmere. He was I could sense his wariness after that, even though he's very enthusiastic about this. I don't want to be a mean host to him. So this time around, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the more dangerous pulls. As of this recording, we are the second week of The War Within Season 2. Some of you folks already kind of know the lay of the land, so we just focus on the more crucial pain points of each dungeon. I'll start with Priory first, and we'll maybe dive into the micro, and then we'll zoom out and talk about the dungeon overall later on. But Ellesmere, I want to get your thoughts on kind of the first pull. This, I've seen the typical park route, which is like you kind of pull the front, 4 packs here. I've seen a variation of this where they actually pull the mini boss Suleiman, and they kind of do like a triple pull around the corner over here. Like, what's kind of your thoughts around the first pull, all the sharpshooters that are very hard to group, on top of, potentially chaining in the mini boss? Like, what's your thoughts around the first room here?
So the whole concept behind pulling the mini boss first is to trigger the RP for the second mini boss earlier. Now, this is a push group strat in order to make the key go quicker, because the only thing that's time gating you in this first area are the mini bosses that you have to kill. So once you kill those, you can move on to the next area. So basically the idea is the faster you can get the mini bosses out of the way, the faster you can go and get out of that area. Now, I do think that it's a great strat time-wise. However, in pugs, I think it's a great way to deplete your key almost immediately. Would not ever recommend pulling a knight plus the mini boss ever, unless you're in a highly coordinated environment, because there's just too many things that can kill people. The main things that will kill people in these packs are the knights, which do an unavoidable AoE, and it also interrupts spell casting. And the other thing to look out for are the sharpshooters. The sharpshooters do a myriad of different abilities, all of which hurt like hell. You've got the shoots and the pot shots, which are basically just random physical damage hurled at a player. And they also put down traps that will trap people and do a ton of damage. Now, those can be removed with freedom, any type of mobility free things like Tiger's Lust, etc. But in general, very dangerous mob when combined with any unavoidable AoE, because the damage from the sharpshooters is also unavoidable. So that means that basically your first pull, if you try to do 2 knights plus marksmans, it's going to be a huge amount of unavoidable AoE damage on top of spellcast locking, on top of marksmans. Now, that is the common pull with Lust. However, don't be surprised if people aren't ready for those knight AoEs. You're just going to see them fall over immediately. This isn't something you can just heal through. If 2 of those knight casts go off at the same time and you don't have a defensive, you are dead, extremely dead, especially if it lines up with any type of sharpshooter. As for the sharpshooter grouping, the key to that is everyone just needs to play in melee. So if everyone plays in melee, the sharpshooters will actually jump into the pack rather than away from it. If you have range standing super far, the sharpshooters will jump to them, and they'll end up being all over the place, and it'll be a disaster. But if everybody just stacks in melee at the start, then the sharpshooters will jump into melee, and once they're there, then you can spread out, once they've jumped in, because they don't jump again for a long time. So yeah, the idea with this first pull is watch for the knight AoEs, use your defensive anytime the disrupting shout is cast, and then make sure that you stack in melee until the sharpshooters jump into the pack.
Great summary. And after the first room, I think there's been a bit of a debate before the season started whether you go left or you go right. I feel like the park scene has decided that going right to do Damien as the mini boss is kind of tough, and people have started just going left in pucks now. Do you have a horse in this race? Is there a firm view that you have here? Yeah,
left. Everybody should go left.
Fair enough.
They tried to tune it a little bit, but it's still just better to go left. Yeah. The only other thing in this first area are just the mini bosses, one of which just does, Thunderclap is just unavoidable AoE. Don't really have to care about that much, except press the defensive whenever it comes up if you aren't topped. And then the other mini boss is the one I wanted to mention really quick, which is the Sergeant, which does Lunging Strike.
Yep.
Chainmail does this ability called Lunging Strike, which you want to make sure that you're spread for. It can also be dodged. So if you're, like a mage or a mobile ranged, you can stand at range, and then when it leaps out at you, you just use your mobility to dodge it, and then you just never take damage from it. It can also be dwarfed because it's a bleed. So, That's pretty much it for that first area, though. And then, going left is definitely the thing that I would highly recommend. I also don't recommend pulling any of the trash at the top of the steps when you walk up to the left side, because it's like 4 sharpshooters, casters, lynxes. It's a bunch of nasty mobs. And you don't need a Mind Soothe or a Shroud or anything. You just wait until the patrol is either far to the left or far to the right. And it's a pretty quick patrol, so you can just wait for a few seconds until it's in a good spot, and then everybody runs by.
Yeah, it's great tips. So naturally, I think the remaining mobs here, there's a few new mobs, a few new casters, and then there's a mini boss that people have to play, which is Amya. And I've seen a lot of people be taken aback by kind of the mechanics here, especially the reflective shield. Kind of walk us through, like from a healer's perspective, why do people fall over in doing this area over here?
The big thing is just combos. It's a lot of casters. Anytime you have a lot of casters, especially in a pug, if you have two casts like the Priest Smite and the Conjure Fireball, if those two things are happening at the same time on somebody, that will kill them. But the big thing here is the Light Spawn. So the Light Spawn only has one major ability, which is called Purification. And that will target one player, and it will hit them very hard. It's going to do... it's like a dot. It's like a channeled ticking damage that lasts for about 5 seconds. And during it, that player is going to take a lot of damage. So you need to make sure that you're watching that player. If a cast is going off on that player at the same time, they either need a big defensive, a lot of healing, or you just need to kick or stop the cast that's on them. That's the big thing to look out for. And then obviously anytime the reflective shield is up on the High Priest, if somebody is in cooldowns, they need to be aware of that, and they're either going to need a lot of healing love, or they just need to pop a personal.
Right, great summary. And then after this whole boss, naturally you clear the patrol. I think we have already talked about what all these mobs do. I think just a quick mention, obviously move the mobs out of the burst of light when the light spawn dies, else they get healed. But then you eventually make it to the first boss, and I think I've heard a lot of healers and tanks kind of talk about how difficult it is to play the left route if you are a tank or healer, because Darkflame is partnered pretty much with Emberlance, who does Holy Radiance, Unavoidable AoE, and a Tank Buster in Divine Judgment. On top of that, Darkflame itself does a Tank Buster, and there's a lot of damage on the tank. From a healer's perspective, and I know you play tank at a very high level as well in Season 1, kind of walk us through from that perspective, like what do you think about in terms of survival here?
This is mostly a tank fight, I'll be honest. It's not really a healer fight. There's not much. There's only one thing that you need to look out for as a healer. The Holy Radiance AoE doesn't hit very hard compared to the other AoEs in the current season at the same key level. Holy Radiance is a relatively low damaging AoE, so you don't really have to ever look out for that. The big thing to watch for is the Savage Mauling from Captain Darkflame. So that's going to leap on one player and do a huge amount of damage to them until the shield is broken. And that can be immuned. It can also be shadow melded, and it can be invised, vanished, etc. Aggro dropped in any way. But if you do that, you still have to break the shield before the cast. So if it ever lines up with his AoE cast, the Battle Cry, you need to make sure you have enough damage to break the shield, or else you're going to wipe your group by doing that. So in general, in pugs, I would never recommend trying to shadow meld or do any of that, aggro dropping stuff on that ability. I would just press a defensive for it. And as a healer, if somebody's ever targeted by that, you just need to make sure that you have a lot of healing for them, a lot of spot healing banked up anytime that's coming up. And you need to look out, especially when that overlaps with the Holy Radiance from Emberlands. That's the big scary moment of the fight. It only happens once, I think, in the fight, but when that does happen, that player is in grave danger. So you have to make sure that you're ready for that one overlap. Otherwise, just dispel the tank whenever they get the tank buster, and it's mostly just a tank fight. It is a brutal tank fight, though, because you have 2 tank busters essentially. You have the Pierce Armor from Darkflame, and you have the Divine Judgment from Emberlands. So your healer needs to be good about dispelling very quickly, and you need to be really good about using your defensives and making sure you have something for each Pierce Armor.
Awesome, great breakdown. Then you get past, I would say, the first boss, and the second boss area is no easy feat as well. I think I've seen different groups try a double, even a triple here. The Templars, the Paladins, there are a lot of unavoidable AoE. Not to mention there's some casters here. How do you approach this room when it comes to, just tackling this in an efficient way?
So this actually appears to be scarier than it really is. So the Paladins do a cast called Sacred Toll, and that's essentially just Divine Toll, where they just cast a bunch of Holy Shocks at us, and it deals a bunch of damage. It's just one flat AoE hit, and they are force desynced. So you'll see this happen throughout various dungeons where certain mobs get force desynced so that if you pull 10 of them, none of them can ever cast at the same time. So you are guaranteed to have at least 5-second or 3-second gap between casts. So as long as you can top your group after each cast, you can pull as many as you want. Now what's going to gate you here are the kicks, because you can't be letting casts go off during the paladin AoEs. Now it's up to your healer how many paladins you want to pull. If if your healer is super confident, then you can pull as many paladins as you want, because every single time that the toll goes off, you can just top them before the next one. Obviously, that has to do with healer cooldowns, what you have available, but that should kind of be communicated if you're in a coordinated environment. And if you're in a pug, general rule, never pull more than 2 packs. If you're in a coordinated environment, though, you can pull 3 packs. You just need to look out for the casters, the conjurers, and the priests. You can't let greater heals go off. You can't ever let holy smites overlap with AoEs, and you can't let fireballs overlap with AoEs, which is the conjurer cast. So if you're able to get enough kicks and enough stops and coordinate that well enough, then as long as it's only the paladin AoEs, you can pull a fair amount of packs at the same time in here.
Awesome, good breakdown. On the second boss, Braunpike, I think mechanically it seems pretty easy to understand. There's a soak mechanic, there's hammers you need to dodge, but I noticed there's a few overlaps that's dangerous. One that I noticed in Parks is when he drops his Castigator shield and everything falls from the sky. There's unavoidable AoE damage, and I just feel like sometimes people fall over at that point in time. What's up with this boss? What do we need to look out for?
So the Castigator Shield's a really weird ability because currently it doesn't have reliable timers, and I don't think it ever will, because the spell queuing is just super wonky with this boss. Basically, the Castigator Shield will act like Avenger Shield. For those of you who don't know, Avenger Shield is going to throw a shield at a player, and then it'll bounce to nearby players. So it does actually, basically, if he has his wings up, which is Vindictive Wrath, then it'll throw the shield at multiple players. But if he doesn't, it's only going to throw it at one. So periodically he'll have wings, and sometimes he won't. When he has wings, you just need to be aware that the Castigator Shield probably going to hit everyone. So it's just going to be a big AoE. And when he doesn't have it, then you can spread out, and it'll only hit one player. And so then it's a lot easier to handle. Overall, it's awkward because you never actually know if the Castigator Shield is going to happen or not. The timers are correct, but sometimes he just won't cast it. I'm not really sure what causes that yet, but for the time being, the big thing is to make sure that anytime you see Castigator Shield coming out, you're ready to either spread or press a big defensive, or both. The overlap on this fight would be anytime the Castigator Shield happens at the same time that you're clearing the circle debuffs. So periodically he's going to cast the Sacrificial Pyre, which is going to create this circle with orbs to soak. And each time that you soak an orb, it does group damage, and the person who soaks it takes a big dot. So when you're soaking that, if Castigator Shield is coming up at the same time, you should either stop soaking, or you need a very big personal and group defensive. My recommendation is pretty much never soak the pyre while the Castigator Shield is coming out. But there is a time limit to how long you have to soak all of the balls in the pyre. So you may need to do that sometimes, in which case that would just be a big personal defensive. My general rule for the pyre soaking is tanks can do 2 and healers can do 1 with a defensive. When in the first half of the fight, it's only 3 charges, so that's very easy to do. But in the second half of the fight, it becomes 5 charges. At that point, you either want to immunity soak, because you can use, cloak, turtle, bubble, stuff like that, and you can just run in and out and in and out and in and out and trigger them all without ever getting a debuff, which is a very good use of your immunity. But there are sometimes when you have to soak without an immunity, in which case it's kind of a group soak. Everybody takes one type of situation, in which case you just need to have a personal for that and a lot of throughput.
Right, it's helpful. You get past the second tough boss, then you make your way towards the final boss. We've covered some of these mobs already, so we won't cover that. But let's talk about the entrance towards the final boss. And I feel like with this patrol in the middle, there's a lot of room for errors in parks where people butt pull or they accidentally just tag stuff in. What's your kind of advice for people clearing around this room, especially given there's such a dangerous mini boss in the middle that if you tag in with any packs is pretty much over, I think. Any thoughts on how do we go about tackling this room?
You have to just be very careful. It's not an easy room because of that. Basically, the way that most groups pull this is you pull the first 3-pack and then the 3-pack to the right of that, G56 and G54. You pull those two together and you can pull them back to the top of the stairs. And that way, you have no chance of, you can LOS them in, so it's easy to group, and you have no chance of pulling anything else in the room. After that, you go over to the right-hand side and tuck yourself in the corner and pull G58 plus the patrolling footman. And that should be pretty easy to not pull anything because there's a decent bit of room that you've made now. Then you just pull the 5-pack once it's in a good patrol. You pull it back towards the same place that you were tanking G58 in that corner area. That way you're kind of just pulling everything away from the other mobs each time. It does mean that you need range kicks on the mages whenever you pull that 5-pack, but you should definitely not just like run into that 5-pack because you're highly likely to pull the mini boss on accident. The big thing also to look for here, Risen Mages, obviously you need to kick the Fireball Volley, which is like the big AoE cast. But the thing that most people don't know is that these mobs that are called Risen whatever, Risen Warriors, Risen Mages, anything that's Risen has a buff on it. And the buff will trigger a big AoE when the mob dies. Now, that can be mitigated if you use CC. So if you stun the mobs right before they die, they don't blow up. Much similar to Amarth from Necrotic Wake, the second boss, where you would, if you couldn't kill all the ads, then you could still CC them right before he would consume them and they wouldn't deal damage to your group. So similar to that, you can do the same thing with these Risen mobs. You just press a CC right as they're about to die, then they won't explode. And that's especially important in the final 2 packs of the dungeon right before the last boss on the left and right of the platform, because there are 6 Risen mobs, and those are just going to AoE blow up your group if you're not prepared for it, or if you don't have any CC. And it's not just stuns. You can use pretty much any type of CC on them. Knocks, blinds, etc., anything. So that's very important to remember in this area, especially when you're fighting the Risen Mages with the light spawn and like somebody's... Or like, actually, the first pull in this area, the 2-pack that you pull... there are Risen Footmen and there are Paladins. So the Paladins are going to use Sacred Toll, and if that Sacred Toll ever goes off at the same time that a Risen Footman dies without being CC'd, your group's going to die because it's just 2 giant AoEs happening at the same time. So that pack in particular, very, very important to look out for when those Risen mobs are dying and try to get a CC if they're overlapping with your Sacred Toll cast so you don't, blow up and yell at your healer.
That's very cool tech. I didn't even know that the stun trick or the CC trick actually works on those. So, there's a reason why I guess everyone wants you back to break stuff down like this. So I feel like I'm really benefiting from this. Just want to kind of pick your thoughts on this. Like Bronpike obviously is just a rod fight. It's kind of like very similar to Kajin from Halls of Infusion. But, from a healer's perspective, other than, press your buttons, is there anything that people should really think about when it comes to healing Bronpike?
Press your buttons. There's no secret tricks. There's no outplays. It's literally just straight rot. The main thing is just make sure people are getting kicks on the priests, because obviously you're pulling 2 priests with it. And if those smites are getting off during the AoE, your healer's going to have a terrible time. That and track your healer's cooldowns. As a DPS player, if you are aware of when your healer is in cooldowns, especially for me, like as a holy pally, if I'm in wings and people press all their defensives when I'm in wings, like thanks for pressing your defensive, but also that kind of killed me, or killed yourself, because now as soon as I run out of my throughput, you have nothing, and now we both have nothing. So it's very important that if you're playing with a cooldown healer, which is most healers currently, that you're aware of when they're in cooldowns and when they're out of cooldowns, so that you know when you actually need to use your defensives.
It's great advice. On to the final boss then. I feel like the first phase is kind of, pretty manageable. A lot of people kind of fall short during the second phase, though, when the boss goes up top, has a shield, adds spawn, and it's just chaotic. Any advice on just dealing with this entire fight in general?
Fight itself, pretty simple. Just look away during the blinding and make sure you have AoE healing anytime that comes out. The intermission is what most people don't actually know about with the ads. They kill themselves. They die on their own. You don't have to do any damage to them. The best strat for this is everybody goes up on one side and all the ads funnel up on that side, and then you just drop like an Ursul's Vortex or a root, root totem, any type of CC to keep them in place, and they will just kill themselves off before they even get to the platform. And that way, the thing that gets people thrown off is that those ads don't have an aggro table. So when they come up, if they make it all the way to the platform, they're just going to start killing people. So if you haven't CC'd them and they haven't died by the time they get up, you just need to go to the back of the room and wait until they kill themselves off. Meanwhile, just keep hitting the boss until she's interruptible, and then interrupt her to phase it.
Great tip on the ads killing themselves. And overall, I think when Ellesmere breaks it down like that, it feels like a lot more manageable, digestible. But overall, it's the whole dungeon. What do you think about the dungeon? Obviously Blizzard kind of nerfed it pretty heavily on the first week. Do you think it's a fair dungeon? I think a lot of people were scared of this dungeon when it first came out. What do you think of it now?
I think the nerfs helped a lot. I think that they still need to do some nerfing on a couple places. I think the main things that I would want to see tuned would be the marksman's, the knight's unavoidable AoE, the thunderclap from the first mini boss. I'd like to see have a longer cast time. Or just have more time in between casts. The light spawn purification should probably deal a little bit less damage. The mini boss in the last area should be toned down slightly. And the risen mob's AoE should be nerfed a little bit. Because I think that's pretty punishing for a mechanic that most people don't even know about. But again, that could just be early season stuff. And the more people get used to the dungeon, the easier it'll be. I think that it's one of those dungeons that gets a lot easier the more coordinated you are and the more that you know the mechanics of the dungeons, compared to other dungeons which aren't quite as punishing if you don't know the mechanics. Could it use a little more tuning in a few places? Yes. Overall, though, I think they did a really good job with this dungeon. I very much enjoy it. And I think that it's punishing in a good way in a lot of places. So yeah, really like Priory.
Awesome. I love the tip. I think this is MVP. Your tip here is going to save a lot of groups headaches on the recent footmen and the mages. So really love the tip about stunning them there. Let's move on to, I think, what people think is one of the harder dungeons in the pool. And we're talking about Floodgate. Even though I was kind of debating whether we should do Floodgate or Meadery first, but they're difficult for different reasons. Let's start with Floodgate though. This is a brand new dungeon. This wasn't even at launch. They kind of cooked for season 2, this brand new dungeon. And I think the tech has kind of evolved as we play through the season. I know at the start in the PTR cycle, people are doing this like mountain pool where they go up on this thing and they jump down and pull the first boss. But it feels like the park scene has kind of settled on just coming down here and just pulling this platform. What do you think about this first pull? Do you prefer to play it, anywhere else?
The big thing that I like to do is, instead of going the way that you drew that blue line, if you draw it to the left instead, yeah, that way, and you go through that 5-pack and then up onto the platform. So then you don't have to wait for the sniper patrol. which saves you some time. And you don't need a Mind Soothe or anything to walk past that Shredinator. You can literally just walk in that line that you drew through that 5-pack and pull it up into there. You get a little bit of extra free count. Actually, a lot of extra free count. And the pull is basically the same, and you don't have to wait for the sniper. So in my opinion, that is the best first pull of this dungeon by a fair margin. It's about a 10.6% first pull, and it is where you pop Lust, and it's not even that dangerous. The main thing to look out for are the Surveyors. Anytime that you pull 2 Surveyors, you have to look out for the Throw Dynamite, because that is an unavoidable hit, and it can go on the same player. So if 2 people, or if 1 person gets targeted by both Dynamites, either you need to use an AoE stop to prevent that, or they need a big external or defensive, because that will one-shot somebody. Outside of that, the Shredinator, you just look for the Shredination cast, and anytime that it finishes its cast, you just start pre-moving. If you're pre-moving, you'll never get even 1 tick of damage on you. So watch for that Shredination cast and just start to pre-move when it's about to go off. Flamethrower has an extremely small radius, so it can be outranged very easily if you're not sure which way it's pointed, but you hear that Flamethrower is going off from a weak aura or something. Back out of melee, you only really need to be 15 yards away and you will not get hit by the frontal. So yeah, make sure that you're aware, because that's one of the few frontals in the game left that has basically no visual indicator. So it can be very dangerous if it overlaps with anything. I highly suggest using an audio cue for that to make sure that you know that it's going off. And if you can't see which direction it's facing, just get out of melee.
Shout out to Ellesmere's frontal weak aura, the one with the big gunshot sound. So you guys can definitely find it from his stream and whatnot. A lot of people use that, so it helps you deal with frontals like that. So that's the first pull. I think the common thing to do after the first pull is people jump diagonally down to kind of work on count around this area. Do you prefer any form of combination here? Like, I see some people pulling the first pull together with the Architect. Some people prefer the Architect in the third pull actually, and they do this first, and they do the next like that. Do you have a preference in terms of sequence, or does it really not matter?
It just depends on your group. There's a lot of different ways that you can pull this dungeon, and that's one of the things. I honestly think that this dungeon has the potential to be one of the best M+ dungeons ever. It's got really good mechanics. It's got really cool mob density and design. There's a lot of unique stuff. It's visually fun. Its bosses are engaging. It's just a very well-designed dungeon. It's one of my favorite design dungeons, considering how early on in the season we are. And it's punishing, but in a good way. Like, it feels fun to beat the healing checks in a lot of these pulls. There could be some tuning still. I do think that that some of the tuning will need to happen, especially on bubbles, and maybe potentially the dots on last boss, as well as the tank buster on last boss, which has depleted a lot of keys. But the changes to Swamp Face early, where the healer can't be targeted by the Razor Choke Vines, very, very big. I love the tuning that they've done in this dungeon, and obviously we're going to go over more, but just as an overall thing, I think that this dungeon is really cool, and I love how differently you can pull this dungeon. I've been in dozens of pugs in this dungeon, and every single one of them pulls it differently, and there is no clear-cut best way to pull it. But yeah, and I think that's a good thing. So
I love that kind of color, because you've obviously seen so many dungeons and from a competitive standpoint over the years. So high praises from you. I love to see Blizzard kind of cook up more of these stuff. I want to home in on a pain point though. I noticed that a lot of pucks kind of underestimate the damage or the danger from the loader bots. Especially people like to chain in loader bots on different pulls, and people just get blown up. It's a fixate mechanic, but it really ticks for very hard. So it kind of surprises people. Is there any counterplays around this, especially when you're chaining pulls where there's loader bots and other mobs involved?
So the big counterplay is that they can be AoE stunned, and they do go on cooldown once you do that. So if you can AoE stun the windups, it's very big for your group. Unfortunately, they can't be blinded, which prevents a lot of other types of CC from working. But the AoE stun is very helpful. Also, the big danger thing is when you have the architect who nails people to the ground. So if you are pulling the architect at the same time as the loader bots, you need to be very aware of anybody who's getting rooted when those loader bots are doing their windup, because they won't be able to escape them, and that's what's going to get people killed. As for like how you pull this area specifically, depends on your group and how confident they are, and what kind of coordination level you have. The key thing is just to remember that kicks are king. You need to make sure that you are never pulling too many mobs that require heavy kick coordination at once. So for example, the surveyor always needs a kick. So if you're pulling 2 surveyors, that's okay, but you need to make sure that you have a kick assigned to each person, to each surveyor, because otherwise they're just going to channel on players, and that can combo with any other thing like a tick of the loader bot or the architect nailing them to the ground, and it's going to hurt like hell. Some groups also pull divers into this pool. Those would be the ones that are patrolling right nearby, and they have a cast called Harpoon. That needs to be kicked because they drop bombs on the ground and it'll harpoon you into the bombs, which will kill you. You just need to make sure that if you're pulling whatever collection of mobs you're pulling, you just need to make sure that there's not too much kick coordination that needs to happen. Now, I will mention the Dark Fuse Hyenas here that cast Bloodthirsty Cackle. You can just let that go off. You don't have to worry about kicking that. The big kicks here are just the surveyors and the divers if you're pulling those in.
Love the breakdown. And then after that, I think a lot of people starts avoiding the snipers up this platform. In fact, some people even wait for this patrol to move to the right before they kind of sneak up over here and pull more. Tell us what's so dangerous about these snipers. Why do people like to avoid snipers in their route as much as possible?
To be honest, snipers aren't that dangerous. It's more that it's just more kick coordination, right? Because you have to kick the trick shot. So again, it just kind of goes back to the thing where I was talking about, where it's like the less kicks that you have to coordinate, the happier you're going to be as a pug. More coordinated groups can pull that stuff in. Obviously, the snipe is unavoidable, but it doesn't actually do that much damage. So as long as you're getting kicks on the snipers, it's not a big deal. General rule, you can pull as much as you want as long as your tank survives, as long as there's not a bunch of unavoidable damage, and as long as there's not a bunch of kicks. So for example, next to that G23, the sniper patrol you're talking about, there are 2 inspectors, 3 soldiers beneath them, and then on the platform below that, there's 2 snipers, 4 hyenas, or 2 hyenas, 2 soldiers, and then there are 5 loader bots above that. You can actually just pull all of that together because there's no unavoidable damage outside of the 2 snipers and then the loader bots, and there's nothing else there. It's just tank damage. So that's what I have been enjoying doing. Obviously, in a pug, that could be a little dangerous because the inspectors do jump behind people and do frontals. Keep in mind that you can actually CC those surprise inspections, and they will not recast. So that's a good thing to send your AoE like blinds on, since you want to save your AoE stuns for the loader bots. If I was in a pug, I probably wouldn't do that pull, but in coordinated groups, I think it's a really good pull just because there's very low kick coordination needed. And as long as the loader bots don't go out of control, it's quite easy to do that pull. There's really no damage going out. Your healer can basically just DPS.
Yeah, love the call out about, things like the soldiers are merely just tank damage. In fact, that kind of leads into why people kind of change the soldiers over here on the stairs into the first boss, which is a nice segue because I think the first boss is very reminiscent of like Mists of Turnasai first boss. There's a burn phase. You got to deal with the ads before the burn phase. Is there any like tips, tricks around this boss? It sounds simple. Kill the ads, burn phase starts, and that's rinses and repeats, but is there like any things that you really look out for in this fight?
Not particularly. You just have to kick the maximum distortion, which will cast on it, like a random mob will cast it, and you just need to make sure that you get the kick on that. Outside of that, it's just dodge frontals and kill the ads, and then make sure you have healing for each burn phase. The big thing that catches people off guard is that if you don't kill the ads fast enough, the boss will put up a shield called the Kilo Block Barrier, and that thing will do a lot of damage to your group, which is especially not great because then you follow that immediately by the AoE intermission phase, which also does a lot of group damage. So that can screw your healer if your DPS are not focusing the ads enough. The big thing that I see kill pugs is just when people don't realize that they should be AoEing and they're just like, oh, I'll just funnel onto the boss. And it's like, that's good normally, but not for this boss.
Good call outs. Then comes, I think, one of the scariest pulls in the dungeon, which is you gotta get the weapon created back here. And I think the most dangerous mob here is the Blood Warper. I think a lot of healers are very afraid of this mob. And I think a lot of them kind of exhaust their healing cooldowns on the first boss, and then they run up here and they're like dry. How do you kind of tackle this? Do you even route around this? Or do you even save cooldowns towards the end? How do you think about this mob over here?
Personally, I don't save cooldowns for it. Mostly because I send cooldowns at the end of boss, and then I'll get it up for the next Blood Warper, because you have back-to-back Blood Warper pulls. The first Blood Warper is not as scary as it seems. The first Blood Warper seems very scary, but the thing that makes the Blood Warper dangerous is if any other damage is coming out at the same time as the AoE. Because once the Blood Warper has finished the Warp Blood cast, like, yes, during the Warp Blood, people will tick down. But you can let people tick down. You don't have to heal it off immediately, as long as they don't get 100 to 0'd by the channel of the Warp Blood, which really doesn't happen until very, very high key levels. Or if somebody's, like, insanely undergeared. So you can let these huge healing absorbs go off, and it's not a big deal, as long as you clear it before the next cast. So this pull is not nearly as dangerous because there are 0 mobs that do damage to any other players except the tank. So the big thing is just dispelling your tank when they get to high stacks of the Black Blood, and then making sure that your healing mainly goes into the tank, because they're going to be the one in the most amount of trouble on this pull. Everyone else, you should be able to AoE heal off their debuffs before the next one. You don't have to sprint to the finish line and make sure that you AoE heal it off while the cast is still going on. That's not a big deal. The next pull is the one where you do have to worry about that, and the reason for that is because there is an unavoidable damage mob in that pack, and that is the Mechagon sniper. So this sniper, in earlier packs I was saying, you know, the snipe doesn't hit very hard, they're easy to manage, all you have to do is get a kick, and that is true. However, when that snipe goes off during the AoE healing absorb, that player is in extreme danger, because you can't just do what you did the last pull, where you just kind of let it go off and heal it off over time before the next cast. You have to be actively trying to clear that person's healing debuff and healing them up a little bit before the next application. So this pull is very, very dangerous. That's why I highly recommend using Lust here. The best Lusts in this dungeon is pull 1. The very first pull, you just Lust that, and then it'll be back up for this Blood Warper pull. Your healer will thank you forever if you Lust this. And if you don't Lust it, you just need to make sure that you have very big either healing cooldowns or big defensive usage from your team, because that sniper combo with the Blood Warper is going to be deadly.
I love the color commentary about, you know, the difficulty curve between this Blood Warper versus this Blood Warper, because I think that is another level of analysis you don't normally get in guides. So I really appreciate the tip personally as well. People kind of take the glider then across the river. And I've seen different combinations of how they want to do the pull here. Like Ellesmere pointed out, this dungeon is kind of open. I think most people kind of start off maybe just chaining in some divers with a pack over here. We've already talked about the architect, but you know, I think I've noticed some people kind of butt pull like crabs when they stand near the edges, and that could turn out to be a very like messy scenario. Any commentary about, I guess, the sequence of which you can pull these mobs? Because some people would also opt to say pull the Shreddinators at the top first and then do pull 9 later. Maybe they can skip a Soothe or something like that. How do you think about this whole area before the second boss?
So the first thing to mention is I wouldn't ever pull in divers with the architect. The reason why is because the architect will nail you to the ground and the divers will place bombs on the ground. And that can be a very deadly combo. If you get nailed while a bomb is getting placed, you can just get screwed and you'll blow up and die. The big thing about the divers that most people don't know is that I mentioned force desync earlier when I was talking about Priory. and the AoE, normally force desyncs only happen with AoEs. However, occasionally Blizzard will force desync cast interrupts as well. And that is something they did with these divers. These divers cast something called Harpoon, which I talked about earlier. But what I didn't mention is that Harpoon is force desynced. So these divers, if you pull all 6 of them, they can't all cast Harpoon at the same time. Only one of them can be casting Harpoon at any given moment. So it's actually very easy to pull all 6 divers and get these interrupts managed without, a bunch of them going off and your group wiping, because it does seem scary. But because of the force desync, it makes it so that pulling those divers together is not bad. So if you want to add divers to your route, I highly suggest when you fly down, the first thing that you do is just pull 6 divers together. Some groups will want to just skip the divers altogether, and that is more efficient because these divers are not the most efficient count. However, pulling 6 of them together is not bad. It's not very dangerous, and it is decent count, and it's not too inefficient. So if your group has a tendency to, face pull these divers or whatever, or you're in like a pug that you don't necessarily trust to play close to them, I would probably just pull all 6 divers as soon as I come down, get them out of the way, clear that area, so that there's no potential issues, and that'll free up, or that'll be a lot easier than it actually seems. Right. As for the architect, I normally pull the 2 architects together. However, it can be very deadly to do that. I don't think I'd recommend that in a pug, and even in really high keys, you might never see that happen because the double nail gun plus the unavoidable surveyor easy throw dynamites that I talked about earlier. Those two, this is what I kind of mentioned about never doing too much unavoidable damage in one pull. This is a pull where you have a ton of unavoidable damage going out. Not too bad if you have a ton of, defensive and healing power for that specific pull, or if you have really big cooldowns. But if you don't, I would recommend against pulling that together and instead split them up. That being said, obviously just pulling one architect with 2 contractors isn't the greatest pull. And I did mention pulling all the divers together. So you could add some crabs into that first pull, or you could pull the 2 divers from G39. If it's only 2, it's a little bit less dangerous than pulling all 3. There's a lot of different things you could do. Like I said, there's so many different routing options here, but just the things to look out for, again, never doing too much unavoidable damage in one pull unless your group is highly coordinated or has big CDs, and then watching out for combos like the divers being able to plant charges while you're nailed to the ground. Right.
I love that breakdown. Then there's this kind of discussion, I guess, if you're doing more coordinated keys, whether it's worth skipping these 2 Shreddinators if you have a Warlock Gate. I think there's some shenanigans around an Evoker kind of like Mount Rescue as well. Is this pull just inefficient on this platform? How do you think about this entire platform over here? Like pull 11.
It's not bad. I think people exaggerate how bad that pull is. It's really not too bad. Again, the Shreddinators are not that dangerous if you just know how to counter them. Like I was saying earlier, you can outrange the Flamethrower extremely easily. The Shreddination, you never have to take any damage from it if you pre-move. And then the Surveyor, you just kick it, and then it only has the 1 throw dynamite cast. So that pull is really not that scary. That being said, it's debatable whether or not it's efficient. I think that if you have a Warlock, it is a good idea to just gate. But as for any other groups, like groups that don't have a Warlock, I wouldn't worry about it. I would just pull that pack, to be honest. It's not that bad.
Makes sense. Then we have the second boss, which I think as well, there are more creative bosses in recent times. There's a barreling charge, like a bowling ball mechanic, gotta knock the bombs out of the way. Then there's a dispel mechanic where you can kind of use the dispel to get rid of bombs. Any tech min-maxy thing that you have came across in your high keys dealing with the second boss here?
The biggest thing is that you can pre-position when you get the debuff. That is the biggest thing by far. That debuff that you have to dispel does a huge amount of damage, not only while it's ticking on you, but also when you dispel it. So if somebody, is not in place for a dispel and you have to wait, they tick down to like 60%, you can't dispel them because it'll kill them. So you have to top them first and then dispel them, and sometimes it can be hard to it scales out of control really bad if you're not pre-placed. So you should be paying attention anytime that cast is about to start. you can see that it's on you like 2 seconds before you actually get the debuff. It even has travel time in the air. So making sure that you're aware of when that cast is coming out and paying attention to if you're targeted. And if you are targeted, you should already know, you should already be looking around you and like see which bomb you're going to clear, and you should run to that bomb. So when the debuff goes on you, you're already at the bomb and your healer can just insta dispel you. I have a habit of basically always insta dispelling, and if they're out of place, then that's too bad. They fucked up. Obviously I don't always do that, but it is pretty common for me to
yeah. Reminds me a lot
for
of
me
like what you mentioned on Siege of Borealis on the last boss. Like you just gotta dispel instantly, else like the person's dead. So coming from someone who has done like high keys, like I think everyone appreciates the advice. Pre-position is the biggest tip there. And then after kind of dealing with the second boss, most people kind of pull these 6 kelps together. I've also seen people get blown up by the 6 kelps. It almost seems as though like the jettison kelp is very underestimated in terms of its damage. Any advice other than using crowd controls? Like, how do you think about these 6 kelps?
These kelps are rough. It's basically just use CCs and get kicks. There's not much else to do. If you don't have CCs, you better have a defensive or a lot of AoE healing, because the jettison kelp is going to rock your world. So be very careful of that and make sure that you're paying attention and have your AoE CCs ready.
Right. I'm very excited to talk about the remaining part of the dungeon, because I feel like that this is probably where a lot of groups start running into trouble. So this Swamp Phase is definitely seen as one of the pug killers of this season. The chain mechanic where everybody needs to kind of move in a very coordinated fashion, a lot of rod damage, a lot of dodging. Is there any kind of min-maxy things that people should keep in mind when it comes to like making sure they get past the heal check, or they just make the healer's life a lot easier? Because I feel like it's a very healing intensive fight.
So that used to be the case. There used to be a lot more that you could do until the change. The change that they made was very, 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 very good. Like just incredibly smart, the way that they did that. Because now your healer never has to worry about being chained to someone, never has to worry about their positioning relative to other people. They can just focus on healing and dodging waves, and they don't care where anyone else is, which is very good because it frees up a lot of mental space for just slamming AoE healing the entire fight. The big thing to pay attention to is that there are ebbs and flows to how much damage intake. It's not your standard rot fight. There's a lot of, it's not like Kajin in Halls of Infusion where it's just the same damage intake for the entirety of the fight. There's actually major damage spikes and then downtime. It appears that there's not, because there is basically just constant AoE ticking damage, but the constant ticking damage comes from this ability called Razor Choke Vines. That is the debuff. Now that healers don't get it, not only do healers not have to worry about dodging, but they also have significantly less personal damage taken during the fight. And now your tank gets it too. So it was actually, when they changed the way that worked, that was actually an HPS requirement nerf as well, because the tank is able to take a lot of the damage too. So because of that, it's important to keep in mind, Razor Choke Vines is the rot that you cannot immune, and it will just deal a flat amount of damage periodically. However, Awaken the Swamp is the big AoE cast. Now, Awaken the Swamp inherently doesn't do that much damage on its own, but when combined with the Razor Choke Vines, that's what does the huge burst of damage. So basically, it's going to be like 15 seconds of medium damage followed by 8 seconds of extreme damage. So you want to make sure that when you're thinking about your defensive usage for that fight, that you're paying attention to when the Awaken the Swamp cast is, and make sure that you have your biggest defensives for that. And same thing for healers. Healers want to make sure that they have their biggest healing points during the actual Awaken the Swamp cast, and not right before it.
Awesome. Great breakdown. So I think that's pretty much like the Swamp Phase boss. I think it's also fair to say that the remaining part of the dungeon is also pretty challenging. There's a few scary mobs, and I think Bubbles, is one of those shenanigans where people try to skip it on PTR. Obviously, Blizzard fixed most of them. I think fixed all of them actually. The very scary dot comes from Backwash. And this, I feel like the damage is just kind of out of control on certain key levels. Is there any advice you have at all for just dealing with this AoE damage?
There really isn't. I do agree that this is the big thing that needs to get nerfed. The backwash ramps up way too fast. It ramps up to 3 stacks, and it all happens over the course of like a few seconds. And then it lasts for like 5 more seconds. So it's basically this like 8-second, similar to Awaken the Swamp. It's just this giant 8-second burst. Unlike the previous boss, though, there is no rot damage anywhere else. So it's just these giant bursts of damage once every, 20 seconds or so. I think that this is way too punishing in its current state. It requires a huge amount of healing. And the bigger issue is that anytime somebody dies, if you release, all of Bubble's abilities have infinite range, basically. So when you release and try to jump down, if a backwash is going off or a bubble cast is going off, it will spawn the bubble where you drop down, or it will give you the backwash when you're like 100 yards away and you'll just die on loop over and over and over again. They really need to figure out how to fix that. I don't think that giving it a small range is the answer, because then people will just outrange the backwash. I'm not really sure what the best solution is. I think the best solution is just nerf the backwash. I do think that the bubbles should have a small range. I don't think that they should be going on people dropping down after they die. The backwash thing, again, I don't think you can really avoid that. I think that's just going to happen. But if you make the actual ability slightly nerfed, it'll cut down on the amount of murders that ability has in the first place. And then that won't be as much of an issue. Yeah, basically overtuned, nerf it.
Love the breakdown. I want to skip a bit of the treasure, and we'll come back to talk about the treasure. But the reason why I'm skipping this is because I feel like the most painful kind of part about this trash is definitely like these two dudes, the jump starters. And I want to ask you, because I've heard different theories about kind of how battery bolt works. It seems that melee kind of takes a lot more damage. And certain healers like Mistweaver seems to be, or maybe even Holy Paladins, I don't know, like they seem to have a bit of a tougher time just because of the range. Kind of tell us like what makes this pool so scary over here on higher keys, these double jump starters.
There is, as far as I'm aware, there is no increased damage to melee players.
Right.
Is that true?
I've heard something about, if you read Battery Bolt, it says that the batteries discharge 5 seconds and 1.1 million nature's damage to players within 4 yards of each impact. So there was some like debate like, oh, is it 4 yards from the Battery Bolt source, the jump starter? And I just...
But the Battery Bolt, I think, is the circles on the ground, right?
Right. Fair enough. Fair enough.
I'm pretty sure that's just the circles on the ground.
Right.
Like the discharge, the battery discharge is what does the unavoidable AoE, but the battery bolt is the circles on the ground that you have to dodge.
Fair enough.
So if you get hit by that, yeah, you're dead. But in general, it's just a dodge plus AoE heal mechanic. That's it. So it is a lot of AoE healing. Again, these guys are force desynced, like I talked about. So they'll never cast at the same time. So as long as you're topping the group in between each cast, and they're pretty spread out, they're like 8 seconds apart. So you have time to top the group in between each one. The big thing is just making sure that you never greed casts. You have to be moving. You cannot try to greed a cast because those circles go out very quickly. And it can be very dangerous if you're trying to. But that's also one of the things that I think makes melee healers good here. You were talking about melee healers being a little weak on these, but I actually think they're really strong because we don't have to cast as much as other healers who can't afford to sit there and cast a spell because they have to dodge immediately because those circles are pretty unforgiving in terms of time from where you see them to when they go off. So I think that the jump starters are just, they're simply unavoidable AoE damage mobs that you have to out heal. And it's similar to any other thing where you want to make sure you're paying attention to your healer's cooldowns and make sure that you have your defensives ready for when your healer is out of juice.
Sounds good.
And then just, dodge the swirlies. And these jump starters are the same in every other pack. So all these other packs, the thing that makes these other packs scary, is when you have the jump starters plus the electricians, which have the dispel mechanic that you have to dispel and the kick that you have to kick. And so if the kicks are ever going off when the jump starters are doing their unavoidable AoE, that's what's going to kill people. Or if you're not dispelling somebody or somebody has to sit a dispel for a bit, that could be extremely dangerous too. So make sure you're watching out for any of those overlaps.
Right. And I love that you already called out the electrician, because I think the middle part that we kind of skipped over, this part, we talked about the inspectors earlier from this kind of dungeon, but the most important one, I guess, is definitely the electrician. The bolt kind of leaving quite a very nasty kind of after effect on people. These are things that I think have been killing pucks. So I think, you rightly already covered that. Want to cover the last boss, because I think it sounds easy. Again, it's like, okay, I understand this, how the mechanics kind of come together, but I feel like there's a lot of problems in pucks that I've noticed. One thing that is particularly a pain point, I've noticed people tend to snipe pools. They will snipe the pools on the sparks, and I don't know if you have any advice regarding that, but also I'm keen to get your thoughts around just the damage patterns in this fight. Some overlaps, or rather some AoE charges just seem, when they do that line AoE thing, seems more difficult than others. Is it spell queuing? How do you think about this fight?
My big thing that I think is overtuned is the Giga Zap, which does the big AoE, or the big, it puts out 2 big single target dots. That is what you want your defensives for. Most people are like, oh, the intermission phase, this is the big AoE damage phase, we should pop our defensives here. But that's actually not great, because that should just be the healing throughput phase. And then the dots, those are what you should be using your big immunities and defensives for. One thing to note is that if you are the first player targeted by the Giga Zap and you have an immunity, you can immune it, and it will actually immune both yours and the other person who gets the Giga Zap debuff as well. You can tell who he's targeting based on, or you can tell who's getting it first based on who he's targeting. So if you're looking at the boss and it's targeting you and you have bubble up, press bubble and you will immune both yours and the next person. Now, that being said, it's not always consistent. There are some cases where it will still hit the second person. I don't know why. Still trying to really figure that out, but I'd say it's about an 80% success rate. So we'll take that. The other dangerous part of this boss is the Thunder Punch. That's what I see murder groups a lot. I just see tanks in pugs get farmed by this ability. Part of that is because they're having to kite their spark into pools, and they're also getting the Thunder Punch at the same time. It's very, very dangerous, and you just need to make sure as a tank that you always have a big tank buster defensive for each one of those Thunder Punch casts. And if you don't have something, ask for an external. As for the Leaping Sparks thing, there's really not much to do. If people are sniping pools, they're going to snipe pools. Obviously, it's good if you can pay attention to where other people's sparks are and see where they're guiding them through. And as a healer, if you can let the melee DPS get priority on the closer pools and kite yours a little bit further out, that is always nice. But that doesn't always happen, and it depends on where they spawn and who they're on, and you can't really tell who the other Leaping Sparks are fixated on at the start. So you can't be like, oh, okay, this is right next to this pool, so I'll let this melee person get it, because you don't know who it's on. It could be on a range that's taking it the opposite direction. So in general, just pay attention to your spark. Don't assume that your spark will get eaten by the very first pool that it jumps over, because somebody else could take it, and just be aware that if somebody else takes it, you need to find a new pool. The other thing that a lot of people don't know is you can literally just walk over those pools. Not the electric ones. Once it's electric, you will die if you step foot in it. However, before they're electric, you can just walk right over the water pools. They do nothing to you. So you can quickly position yourself by just running through them and standing on the opposite side. Just make sure that when a spark hits the pool, you're not standing in it, or you will die. As a healer, the main thing to look out for is the second set of Giga Zaps. Obviously, the AoE phase is just a big AoE damage phase, and then you have the first Giga Zaps after that, but then you have the Leaping Spark downtime, so you have lots of time to top people. It's not dangerous. The dangerous part comes on the second set of Giga Zaps in each phase. that is going to be Giga Zap followed immediately by the intermission. So you're going to have those people already low from Giga Zaps going into intermission. That's going to be super dangerous. So that is where you want your biggest throughput, is when the second Giga Zaps are coming out. You want to make sure you top those players and you're ready for the AoE that's going to happen just a few seconds after that.
Yeah, I really love the systematic breakdown. Quick detour, because I've really noticed that just in the past hour that we've been talking about dungeons, you really gave us 2 tech. One regarding the Giga Zap like immunity thing if you're the primary target, and then the other is the stun on the risen kind of mobs. It's quite clear, like, not only in this podcast episode you covered all these like quirky techs, but in the past you've also covered all these. I guess my question is, like, how do you go about thinking about and figuring out all these things? Is it through watching VODs? What do you spend, I guess, your time outside of the game on? Is it like, do you watch VODs? Do you look through logs to figure these things out? Like, how do you think about that part of the game?
It's a bit of both. Sometimes it's just testing. Sometimes it's other people find out that I play with, and then they tell me. Sometimes it's watching VODs. Sometimes it's looking at logs. There's so many different things. And also just like playing with people and talking. The more that you just talk to other people about mechanics and, get in voice and people chat and people will find things out, it's a huge game and you never know who has all this sort of knowledge. I think I figured that immunity tech out from some random pug who was like, oh, I noticed this. And I was like, really? And then we tested it. And it's just like, you never know who's going to know this stuff. And the more that you just chat with people and, get involved with other players that enjoy the game and are passionate about the game, you're going to find a lot of stuff out just from doing that alone. And then obviously, watching VODs of other push groups, of other high key players and, looking at logs and stuff like that. That's part of it too. But yeah, a lot of tech just comes from random pugging and just like talking to people.
A true student of the game. Thanks for all the tips. And this is definitely, I would say, like you said, a very interesting dungeon in terms of like the way you can pull. I will kind of move on to Cinderbrew now, because I think this dungeon has been very thoroughly covered by you. Cinderbrew was one of those dungeons where I think at the start of the expansion, a lot of people were very excited about this dungeon because they think the fantasy is good. I think the name conventions were a lot of hilarious puns, but they come to the fortified affix and people just kind of struggle with this kind of dungeon. In fact, I do think that on certain pools like the Hobgoblin, like maybe the damage is even overtuned. Not too sure, but we'll get there. Let's talk about this first area first, because I've seen a lot of pucks, they see these high key pushers pull like a very big pool in the first pool and they just fall over to the dots and the bleeds. Kind of tell us what's like the no-no, what should we not do in the first pool in terms of like segmenting all these different groups.
So the big danger mobs here are the hired muscle. The hired muscles are the ones that put out the volatile kegs, which is the big AoE dot, and they're also the ones that do the throw chair, which is an unavoidable big physical damage hit to a random player. Both of these things combined can lead to very dangerous overlaps, especially when you're not kicking the room attendants. The room attendants are the ones that do what's their names? The pyromaniacs, sorry. The pyromaniacs are the ones that do the boiling flames, and that is the channeled damage. And if you're not kicking that, it's very, very, very dangerous for whoever is getting channeled on. The other thing that I see farm even push groups is Cinderbrew toss from the attendant. That is just going to put swirlies on the ground, and when you're pulling a bunch of mobs, it's almost impossible to see them. I would highly recommend a sound cue, especially as a tank, because if you get hit by this as a tank, you get disoriented and your group is dead immediately. So, big thing to look out for here, always constantly watching your feet. If you can't see what's below your feet and you hear that there is, a Cinderbrew toss going out, get out. Just move until you can see your feet again. The other thing to look for, obviously the hired muscle. If you're pulling 2 hired muscle in the first pull, you better either be extremely coordinated, have a shit ton of damage, or you're just gonna die, because those hired muscles do too many combos with 2 throw chairs, 2 giant AoE casts. It requires a huge amount of healing. That's what's gonna get you killed the most. So splitting up the hired muscles is one easy way to do this area. And there's only 3 in this first area, so that means you can do this whole first area in 3 pulls pretty easily. It's only when you try to do it in 2 pulls that things start to get really hard.
Fair enough.
One thing that you can do is some of the Pyromaniac pulls, especially on the left side, the like back 3 and the 3 on the far left. Those packs can be pulled in with boss. The reason I like to do that is because it's basically, they aren't even mobs. They're just extra funnel for your DPS players. The only thing you have to do is get the Dispel as a healer from the Pyromaniac, and then get the kick on Boiling Flames. So if you can do both of those things, it's very free count to pull them into boss. Again, that just depends on your healer and making sure that your healer knows that they need to be dispelling and knows about all that. Like, probably wouldn't just randomly pull them into the boss with the pug, but that can make it so that you can kind of cut down how many mobs you need to pull in the previous pulls so that things are a bit more manageable. But in general, for a pug, I highly recommend doing this first area in 3 pulls, each pull having 1 hired muscle. Then you have Chef Chewy. Do not pull Chef Chewy with any mobs ever, period. If you ever pull Chef Chewy with mobs, prepare to die. This guy is so dangerous because he puts out an aura that makes the mobs not CCable. You can't kick them, you can't CC them, you can't do anything, and they deal more damage. So pulling him with essentially any mob is basically certain death. Yeah, that's pretty much it for that for that area of trash. As for the boss, there's really nothing to worry about. You know, the intermission barely does any damage anymore after the nerf. And the big thing that you need to look out for is the Throw Cinderbrew. That's what's going to kill people the most. Whenever you're getting Throw Cinderbrewed on, I tell people it's the same thing as Siege of Borealis last boss. You can actually see the projectile flying at you and know that it's going to land on you. And so you can start to pre-move, because the big thing that's going to kill people is standing in the goop that you drop when you get hit by Cinderbrew, plus the dot. The dot hits extremely hard. So healers have to make sure that they have big CDs for that. And if you're ever sending a defensive, it should not be on the intermission. It should be on those dots. That's what's going to kill you. And the big thing that kills people is when they take the first tick of the dot and they don't get out of the goop that they drop at the same time. So that is almost assuredly a death every time if both of those happen, which is why I always tell people, watch the boss. When that cast is coming out, look for the projectile flying at you. And if you see it, start to pre-move. So that way you guarantee you're not going to get slowed by the stuff under you, and you're not going to take a tick.
Awesome. That's a breakdown. And I think most people will go to Epus's wing, and this is where it gets really messy. I feel like the chance of just pugs dying on some of these pools is just really high, especially the double hobgoblins. Is this a scenario where it's just like, okay, I just single pool the hobgoblins? Or if I do want to group the hobgoblins with some of these packs, what should I look out for? There just seems to be a lot going on in these pools. If you can just kind of give us some advice. Yeah.
I don't think it's the hobgoblin's fault. I think that the hobgoblin is taking the fall for the more dangerous issue, which is that there are a billion casters in this area. And the casters all do very dangerous stuff. First off, you have the flavor scientist, which will heal people, so you want to kick that. They also spawn a failed batch, which creates these barrels that you have to kill. The barrels do take AoE damage, however, which is a very nice change. It's similar to the totems in Stone Vault at the last area, except instead of only being able to single target them, now you can AoE. So if you're in AoE cooldowns, you basically never need to swap. You only need to swap if people don't have a lot of damage. So that's not bad, but they have the heal cast that you need to kick. Then the taste testers basically spam this cast called Free Samples, which does a huge amount of single target unavoidable damage to somebody. And then you also have the Pyromaniacs, which need to be kicked, which do the Boiling Flames. Couple all of that with the Hobgoblin unavoidable AoE, and you're going to have an absolutely terrible time. The big thing with the Hobgoblin is you need to make sure you're crashing it into a wall. You do not want it to just go flying a random direction, because it's just going to run away from all your damage, and it's going to take forever to kill. So make sure that you're pointing it towards the wall, and then you need to make sure that you're also dodging it once it runs at you. So you need to be far enough away that you can avoid the sprint into your direction, but close enough that you're not making the reckless delivery just charge 100 miles away from the pack. They definitely are scary. I don't know if nerfing the reckless delivery is the move. I think one of the things that they should do is make it so that they don't spawn blobs every time they crash into a wall. I think that creates a lot of tank aggro issues, especially because they already have the blob spawning at the end when it dies. So either make it so that the blobs spawn when they die, or that they only make it spawn when they crash, but doing both is just really obnoxious for the tank. Just constant aggro issues, and leads to a lot of deaths because of that. So I think that's probably how I would nerf the Hobgoblin. As for the casters, I would just reduce the amount of casters in here. I would put a few more non-caster mobs in this area, replace some of the taste testers with mobs that don't cast. There's just every single mob in this area is a caster. Every single one. It's either a taste tester, a flavor scientist, a pyromaniac. They're all casters. And because of that, there's just too many kicks, too much coordination. That's what's leading to people dying, especially when you combine that with the unavoidable AoE from the reckless delivery. And I think that's kind of the only complaint I've had this season about like kick management and mob density is this one area. Blizzard really put just way too many casters in this area. So that would definitely be something I hope that they look at changing. But for now, the best outplay is just make sure that you prioritize your kicks. You want to have your ranged kicks on the pyromaniacs because they have a much longer ICD. You want your melee kicks on the taste testers. And if you have a purge, you want to be purging the flavor scientist heal. That way you don't have to spend a kick on it, and you can just focus on kicking the actual damaging abilities.
Great advice about like even kick assignments. I love that breakdown. That also kind of makes a lot of sense given, you know, like you said, a lot of people seem to think that it's the Hobgoblins' kind of issue, when really it's just the management of casters. And I love that breakdown. And you have actually succinctly summarized, I think, the rest of the room here all the way to the boss. And speaking about the boss though, I kind of like to cover, I think there's some, you know, obviously there's some tech about how you want to spawn the ads and whatnot. But is there any general advice on how you want people to kind of use this room and space? Because I know some people actually leave this pack G28 in the corner and they just leave it there. They don't want to pull that pack. How do you think about space management of the boss over here?
The biggest thing here is you want to make sure that you're never too close to a wall. As a tank, whenever IPA is doing the spouting stout, the big AoE that spawns the ads, if you're too close to a wall, it will spawn ads in a horrible place, generally like right on top of the boss, and you will wipe. So make sure that you're never too close to a wall. Outside of that, it's just on everybody else to help with stuns, knocks, slows, anything that you have to make sure that those blobs never hit the wall. Not really much to worry about from a healing perspective. Make sure you get, when the dispels are coming out, you want to make sure that you get one immediately and then just prio heal the other player. And obviously you just want to AoE heal when it does the spinning phase. Outside of that, it's just keep the blobs away from the boss. So positionally, make sure you're not too close to a wall, and make sure that your tank is kiting, and be aware that the tank buster, the bottom's uppercut, knocks you back. So you don't want to get knocked back into like a kite path where you would walk the boss into a blob. But yeah, there's not like a whole lot of great counterplay in terms of positioning outside of making sure that you're CCing. It's more important that you're CCing the ads and managing ads rather than like exactly positioning the boss in a specific place. Just make sure it's not near the walls and that you bring it out of the ads as soon as they spawn. And if there's an ad in a really bad spot, you should use your single target stuns or AoE stuns or knocks or something to get it away from that spot so your tank can move the boss out of that area. And then you can try to group the blobs and just AoE them down.
Right, love the breakdown. So that's kind of this wing. Then the next wing isn't any that much easier either, in my opinion. I think a lot of people underestimate the kind of damage that the little bees do. A lot of people see, I think, these big humanoids and they think like, oh, there's danger. But I've definitely seen people kind of underestimate bee venom and the final sting and all that. When it comes to the trash alongside this entire corridor, any advice on how best to break them down or to segregate the pools?
So the best strat here is you want to make sure you're getting kicks on Bestial Wrath, which is the Bee Wranglers, and you want to make sure you're getting your kick on the Purveyor, which does the Honey Volley. If you're getting kicks on those two abilities, you shouldn't have too bad of a time in here. The Worker Bees doing the Shredding Sting, just make sure you're aware if you get multiple stacks of that Shredding Sting, you either need to use like a Dwarf racial, or you need to use a big defensive or something because it will hit very hard. And just watch for any time that lines up with the unavoidable AoE. There's only one unavoidable AoE in this area, and that's Swarming Surprise. It doesn't actually hit that hard, and it is physical damage. So it does get DR'd by armor. It's not that bad. Basically, just watch out for if that ever overlaps with an unavoidable, with high stacks of Shredding Sting. And when I say high stacks, I mean 2 or more. That Shredding Sting does a lot of damage. Or the Bazooka. Now, the biggest outplay here is that Bazooka, a lot of people don't know, it has an extremely small range. By extremely small, I mean about 20 yards. So for ranged players, if you're standing more than 20 yards out, even if the Bazooka is like, it's going to be aimed directly at you, but you can actually see the visual animation of the shot falling off within 20 yards. So you can outrange all of the damage from this. And that's the most dangerous thing in that area, is when the Bazooka lines up with any other thing. So as a ranged, just play far away from those. You don't have to play too far. Just play like 30 yards away. You obviously don't want to be outranging your healer, but play a little bit away and then make sure that you're getting your kicks. And if you can, try to use single target stops on the final stings so that they don't all happen at the same time. The worst thing you can do is have like 4 or 5 final stings go off at the exact same time on your tank because you're AoEing everything down evenly. That will kill your tank. If that happens, you need to try and desync them by just using single target CC on 1 or 2 of the bees to kind of spread out that damage taken from your tank.
Right.
As for the little beelets, the tiny little bees, the bee venom cast that they do, it's just a tank dispel. You need to start dispelling the tank anytime that they get to high stacks. I generally opt to dispel around 10 stacks. There are certain pulls where there are so many that the tank is going to build up to like 20 or 30 stacks in between your dispel cooldown. At that point, it's really helpful if you can send an AoE stun in between your healer dispels, or if your tank just has a big external or defensive to last them through until the next dispel, that works too.
Love the breakdown because you pretty much covered every variant of mob here. I think it's all about paying attention to what things that you mentioned. Obviously, most people do the strat where they simply jump down at the diagonal of the stairs over here, or rather this platform. They jump down at this diagonal and they just clear out this platform for the boss. This boss also seems like one of those things that people kind of underestimate the damage patterns. I think the honey marinade on the tank has surprised me like sometimes, like even when I drop the pool of fire, that's where like I feel like things can get really dicey. But kind of walk us through from your point of view, like why do deaths occur on this boss? What do we need to look out for?
The biggest thing to look out for is the Blizzard boss. Jumping into these barrels can be extremely deadly for your PC. I DC pretty much 80% of the time that I hop into one of these bees. I think it's a healer thing because most healers I know that try to do it get DC'd. I don't know for sure what causes it. I do know that there is one thing that guaranteed causes it, which is summoned pets. So hunters, like BM hunters, when they're in their cooldowns, if they hop in, it'll bug out. Ellie shamans a lot of the time when they spawn their tier set guy, it'll trigger it as well. Summon pets is generally a recipe for disaster for trying to hop in one of these barrels. As for why I get DC'd, no idea. Absolutely no clue. Not sure what is up with that, but I really hope that they can figure it out because I would love to do the mechanics of this boss. Outside of that, the only other thing to look out for is the unavoidable AoE as a healer, Fluttering Wing, obviously. You want to look out for any time that Fluttering Wing is going off if anybody has the dots, because this boss is going to summon those same mobs that put out those nasty dots on players, the bleeds that I talked about earlier called Shredding Sting. If anybody gets more than one stack of that, they're going to be in a lot of danger, especially if it's during the Fluttering Wing. So watch out for that. Obviously, like you said, the tank needs to watch out for the Honey Marmalade. It hits very hard. And melee DPS and melee healers need to make sure that they're not standing in the tank ability. And then you just need somebody who can consistently hop in barrels and shoot them at, or sorry, hop in bees and shoot them at the barrels without DCing or their game breaking.
Hopefully Blizzard looks at that, because obviously we all want everyone to contribute to mechanics. But thanks for the breakdown.
That would be nice.
Yeah, that would be nice. But thanks for the breakdown on the boss. Then we have the final area where you have all these yes men. I know there's some like tech where people are trying, like, if you kill them all evenly within like 0.5 seconds, they all die. Is that even viable? By the way, I just want to ask you before we move on to the boss.
I would not recommend trying to do that. The one tech that I have played around with that is a little fun is you can actually outrange the heal. So if you pull 3 of the mobs, or if you pull all the mobs to like one corner of the room, right, like up by the stairs at the top, you can taunt one of the mobs away when it's low to the other side of the room, and if you kill it on the other side of the room, the other mobs will not heal.
That's
so you can actually mess around with that. It's pretty fun. In general, though, probably just, don't try to mess around with this too much. Just single target down one at a time, and it's very, very easy. Not much to talk about here. The boss is much more interesting to talk about, though.
I love that you point out, because when I was doing this boss, I think the first 1 or 2 weeks, there was when I was reminded that, oh shit, I need to reach out to Ellesmere, because I remember us talking about Stone Vaults, and you covered Etna, and we talked about the sequence of breaking out the pillars, and it kind of reminded me like, oh, maybe he has a point of view of like what the optimal sequence of breaking the barrels are. So would love to get your thoughts. How do you think about the tank frontal and kind of like the DPS dropping puddles on the big barrels? What's the best sequence to detonate the bombs here?
So I love this because it's just like Edna, like you were talking about. It allows healers to control how the damage of the fight is dealt, which I think is a really, 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 really good mechanic that I'm glad Blizzard is bringing back for this season. Anytime that healers can control the damage profile of a fight, it allows for every healer to be happy, right? Normally, you're forced into, healers that excel at rot fights have to do burst AoE healing, or healers that excel at burst AoE healing have to do rot fights. But this one allows you to play the fight and heal the fight as you wish. If you want all the damage to be dealt in one go, you can do it that way. If you want it all to be dealt spread out, you can do it that way. And that's what's really cool about this. So in my opinion, there is a meta strat. The meta strat is to just have your tank do all of them. And you would want the very first frontal to hit 2. Then all the players with their small circles, they should only hit the small barrels. And just let the tank hit them. So the tank does 2 with the 2 big ones with the first frontal, and then it does 1 big one with the second frontal, and then it doesn't hit any big ones with the third barrel or with the third frontal. That makes it so that the whole concept of this is you don't want any of the cindering wounds, which is the dot that goes on players. You don't want any of that to be happening when the intermission AoE is going on. So if you pop barrels at the last second with the third frontal, if you pop some of the big barrels, you're going to be entering into that intermission phase with that dot. And it's going to be extremely dangerous. Now, it's not bad if you get one at the very end, which is why I always let 1 go off at the very end. But some healers will want 2 to go off at the very end. Based on, they might just want 1 with the first frontal and then 1 with the second. But every healer should always basically want none with the third, because that's the most dangerous overlap that you can get, is if you're popping them with the very third frontal right going into intermission. That being said, like I said, it depends on the healer. I'm an Hpal, so the way that I think Holy Pally should do it is 2-1-0, and then the players only hit small barrels with their circles. And I think that you're going to have a very good time healing it that way. But yeah, you can pretty much do it any way that you want. You just need to communicate with your tank how you want it done.
Love the breakdown. So that's kind of pretty much it for Cinderbrew. Overall, would you, there's a lot of debates, and I'm sure, you've got this a lot in your stream. People come in and ask you, like, what do you think is the hardest dungeon? Would you say the crown still goes to Priory, or is Cinderbrew like a secret, difficult park dungeon? How do you think about the difficulty of this dungeon overall?
I think it just depends on if you're pugging or in a coordinated group. I think that Cinderbrew is not too bad in a coordinated group, but I think it's actual hell for pugs. I think it is probably the worst. Similar to last season. What we had a dungeon that was like that last season. Let's see, the War Within. City of Threads. City of Threads was actually a pretty fun dungeon in coordinated environments, but in pugs it was a catastrophe. It was just a complete and total mess constantly. So there are some dungeons that are just meant to be done in coordinated groups, and there are some that are not. And this is definitely one of those that is meant to be done in a coordinated group, mostly because of the caster area, but also the first area. I think that's something Blizz should look at changing, because I don't like that any dungeon is designed in that way, where it's significantly harder to pug than to do in a coordinated environment. I think there are plenty of great ways of making difficult dungeons that aren't significantly harder in pugs versus coordinated groups. And I think that Cinderbrew Meadery is an example of one that is done probably wrong. That being said, if you are playing in a coordinated group, I love it. It's a really good dungeon in my opinion for coordinated groups, but it's hell for pugs. So I would like to see them kind of change that strategy in terms of dungeon design in the future.
Right, that's great feedback. Then we move on to kind of Rookery, which is the last kind of the War Within dungeon of the season before we talk about returning dungeons.
Wait a second. We haven't talked about Darkflame.
Oh, there's Darkflame. Oh, I totally forgot about that. Well, there's so much, for the minecart that I've totally, put out of my memory. But yes, there's still Darkflame. But since I'm on Rookery, we'll take a bit of a breather from so-called the more challenging technical dungeons. Talk about Rookery. I think it's a bit more chill. So on Rookery, I think the first pull, I think, most people nowadays, they tag in the 4 pack over here, G1. Is that kind of free count to be done with the first pull over here? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to kind of speed run this because Rookery is very straightforward.
Sure.
This first pull, nothing. Just kick the Thunderers and that's it. And dodge the frontal. Most people forget that this Quartermaster has both a frontal and a backle, meaning it returns on its way back. So dodge the frontal, but then get ready for it to come back. Then you fly over. This whole area is just the same thing done slightly differently every single pull. You've got the Unruly Storm Rooks, which their only ability is just the suck, which just does a bunch of damage to one player over the course of a few seconds. You need to look out anytime that overlaps with a kick. The kicks are the Thunderers, which do the lightning bolts. You also need to look out anytime that overlaps with the Void Rider. The Void Rider is the most dangerous mob here. It puts out the dodging stuff, and it puts out Localized Storm, which just does a big, unavoidable, ticking AoE damage. So if that ever happens at the same time as an Unruly Storm Rook, you need to have a huge defensive or external for that player, because they're going to get screwed. Outside of that, it's just kicks, and that's it. There's really nothing else to talk about in this area. As for the boss, nothing to talk about there either. Spread for the only mechanic of the fight, and then anytime that it leads to the center, people just need to know the one trick, which is stay off of the grates. There are 4 grates throughout the platform, north, south, east, and west. Or there are 4 main platforms, and then in between them there are these great hexagons, or I don't know what they're called. Quadrilaterals, I don't know. But they're graded, and that is where the beams are gonna spawn. And those beams will kill you. So as long as you stay on the flat surface, on the actual ground, you're gonna be fine, and then just rotate in a circle. There's nothing else to talk about in that area.
Awesome. I'd love to ask you about this next part though, because I feel like the diffusers are, kind of farming people in parks right now. And obviously there's other mobs here to talk about, like there's the crushers, but by far the diffusers, especially the 2 at the end, are farming people. How do people think about this part, and how do we deal with the diffusers?
Very punishing. They need to nerf Arcing Void. That's the big thing. Arcing Void is inherently a fine ability. There's nothing wrong with it, but it gets awful when it overlaps with attracting shadows. Now, that only happens on the first cast of the mob. After that, it starts spreading it out. So the most dangerous part of that entire pole is the very beginning. As a paladin, especially on the double diffuser, I like to just walk in and press bubble the second they start sucking. That will immune me from all the awful shit that's about to happen, and I can just stand on top of them to avoid the arcing bolt spreading, or arcing void. Arcing void does a huge amount of damage in a very large radius. I think they need to nerf the radius that it deals damage in, as well as nerf the actual hits of the cast, because it's unavoidable. But the biggest thing to look for is anytime that you're getting arcing voided or leapt on by crushers during that attracting shadows AoE. It's all just about overlaps. Again, you'll notice this in every single dungeon. I talked about it previous season as well. Most of M+ and survivability is about knowing the dangerous overlaps, which is anytime that there's unavoidable damage being taken from multiple sources. So that would be, the only is the arcing void, the attracting shadows, and the crusher's void crush. Those are the three unavoidable. Outside of that, you just need to make sure you're getting kicks on the void bolts, and then just look for any time that you are getting, arcing void plus lepton, or attracting shadows plus arcing void, or attracting shadows plus void crush. Any of that combo is probably death, and that's what's killing Pugs so much, is those combos. So make sure that you're saving your defensives for that. Don't just lob your defensive on the very first AoE that happens, because your healer will cry and you will probably die.
Right. Great advice regarding the diffusers. Definitely the most problematic there. We then have Goran, the hot potato boss. I think most people understand the hot potato mechanic. Do you have a preference of whether the tank should take double of the debuff towards the end, the fourth tick? Do you have a preference from a healing perspective?
In my opinion, yes. It should always be random person to tank to melee DPS, or melee healer back to tank. And you can just do that every single time. If it starts on the tank, then it would go tank, followed by a melee player, followed by a random other ranged player, then back to tank. And so if it ever starts on the tank, you ideally want to pass it to two other people first and then back to the tank. That way they don't have to take the double unnecessarily. But if it doesn't start on the tank, I think the best rule is always just tank. The first person to get it brings it to the tank. Tank passes it to a random melee, and the melee passes it back, and then you're good. It can be pre-immuned with AMS, and it's awesome to do that, but it cannot be pre-immuned with almost any other immunity. So have fun, DKs. Sorry, the rest of you.
Good advice on the second boss. Then we'll skip this mobs here, because these mobs are going to be covered in the coming section where we talk about the bottom, where we talk about the Ascendant. We already covered the Crushers. This sequence of pulls here, I think a lot of people underestimate the Void Stone and the kind of stacks that it can gain from just the mobs near it. What makes this area so dangerous when there's all these big Void Stones around?
So at 40%, this guy is going to transition and he's going to start pulsing AoE. And if he gets too many stacks from nearby enemies dying, then he's going to do a lot more damage from that pulsing AoE. That pulsing AoE already hits hard without a damage amp, but then you add, plus 40% damage to it, and all of a sudden it is just like almost one-shotting your team every tick. So gotta look out for that. If your healer has a ton of cooldowns, it's up to you whether or not they feel comfortable chaining in a bunch of smallies with that mob. But in general, the rule that I have is don't do that unless your healer says that it's okay. The best thing to do here is, or one thing to know about the Void Stone also that a lot of people don't know and will end up killing you, is that its melees cleave. So every single melee that it does, if you're standing near the tank, you're gonna take damage. And I myself included, a lot of people are like, what am I dying to? Like, what is this random AoE damage that I'm taking? Because they don't know that its auto attacks cleave. So make sure that as a melee player, you are not standing near the tank, especially as soon as the pulsing AoE ends, because it's going to go straight out of the pulsing AoE with a melee, and that is what kills people more often than not.
I did not know that. How did you figure out like the melee actually cleaves? That's
Well, we were
interesting.
taking random damage, and I was like, there should be 0 damage happening right now. What are you guys even dying to? And they're like, I think it's the pools. And I'm like, no, it's not the pools. And then we looked at it, and then we're like, wait a second. His auto attacks are cleaving us. And then we looked at MDT, and yeah, sure enough, volatile void. Melee attacks cause void energy to explode on the target enemy, inflicting damage to players within 3 yards. So that's what you got to look out for. Do not stand on your tank. As
Very
for
good
the
advice.
ascendants in this area, these ascendants are actually not too hard to handle as a healer if you know the strat to it. This Feasting Void ramps up very quickly. However, once you heal off the Healing Absorb, that cast will do nothing to you again. So it'll continue ramping horribly until you just die, until it gets healed off. However, if you heal off, as soon as you heal off the first ramp, it cannot continue ramping on you. So if you have a big burst of healing when it initially goes off, you can actually heal it off immediately, and it will just not do anything for the rest of the cast, which is very, very big. And a lot of players don't know that, and they end up trying to ramp their healing as it goes, and they just fall further and further and further behind, because the faster you can clear it, the less damage you guys are going to take from it. So make sure that you prep your healing before this goes out, and that you have a big burst of healing. And that includes, like hunters can exil, priests can, DP. Everybody that has a short cooldown self heal should be actively using that anytime the Feasting Void hits. And that's going to help you a lot.
Right. It's good advice. Last boss, I noticed some random ass deaths like in parks, especially when the big AoE knockback and hit comes by. That sequence of events sometimes seems troubling in parks. What's going on there? What do we need to take note of?
Bro, I hate this boss more than life itself. This is the worst. I cannot. This season owns these dungeon pools. This dungeon pool is amazing. These dungeons are god tier. This is somehow the worst healing fight Blizzard has ever created, while also requiring no healing at all. It's somehow like the healing requirement for this is almost non-existent, and yet it is the most miserable, awful fight. This is exactly how you do not create a fight that anyone will enjoy. Like this is the worst possible fight design that I can think of. Now, this could all be fixed immediately, by the way, if Blizzard made it so that, the boss put out an aura on the healer that increased your range by 100 yards, anything at all to help your healers out. But the fact that there's so much area denial going out on this fight at the same time that you have to have players spread out across a 200-yard platform to be getting, soaks a mile away and then dropping pools and melee, it's a disaster. It's a complete disaster. And I say that with all the love in the world for the devs that created this awesome season. This fight is not it. Do not design fights like this. This could be fixed though. I said this when I first did this fight. I said the best solution for this possible would be you have to do the pillar soaks with the AoEs, with the circles. If a healer soaks a pillar, they get a buff that increases their range by 50 yards, Do that. You do that, it encourages healers doing the mechanics, and it rewards you, and it makes the fight not just absolutely miserable. As is right now, it is truly awful. There is no good strat. I still haven't figured out what to do. Half the time I'm running around like a chicken without my head, sprinting from one side of the platform to the other, trying to heal and dispel my players. It's miserable. So all of you that are crying and struggling with this boss as a healer, I feel you. It is no easier for coordinated groups to do it than it is for pugs. It's miserable for all of us. I really hope Blizzard does something about it. And make the pools smaller. That could work too. Make it so there's less area denial. Make it so that the shards spawn close to melee. Anything at all. But as is, I hate the design of this fight. As for what you're saying, yes, watch out for the overlaps. Obviously, the big thing that's gonna cause danger is the dispels happening at the same time as the AoE. So if that's ever happening to you and your healer is 100 yards away, which will likely happen, make sure you have a big personal or a health pot or something.
I truly hope they listen to you, because I think not only are you crying, I know of some preservation evokers who are crying about this boss, just because like the range limitations is just absolutely miserable. So it's still early in the season. Blizzard can still save it. So Blizzard, if you're listening, I sincerely hope you consider this man's kind of advice here. So that's kind of Rookery in a nutshell. I kind of want to move on to the dungeon I almost forgot, which is Darkflame Cleft. And this is something that, there were a lot of debate about whether this would be the worst dungeon ever. I haven't really loved the minecart mechanic, but I don't mind it after the buffs to the move speed. Like, before we even dissect the dungeon, what do you think about this dungeon overall, this minecart RP thing? Because it was such a hot topic in the community.
I said it at the very start of season 1 when I was just doing Mythic 0. I said, this dungeon is actually going to be fun. People are crazy for thinking it's going to be so awful. And obviously people were like, well, the tuning's going to be miserable, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this happens every single season. Tuning gets changed so much whenever the dungeon is in the M+ pool. Prior to that dungeon being in the M+ pool, Blizzard doesn't care at all about tuning for Mythic 0 when things get released initially. Like, they care a little bit. They're obviously not going to have like one-shot mechanics in Mythic 0, but the tuning was bound to change. And I knew that, like, mechanically, there were a lot of things to love about this dungeon, and it was very unique, which is something that I like. It's Blizzard trying new stuff, having very unique mechanics for every boss. I really like this dungeon, and I know that's probably a hot take because a lot of people probably still don't like it, but I think it's a lot of fun. I am going to kind of speed run this as well because there's a lot to talk about and I am running out of time. So I'm going to kind of speed run this as much as I can. This first area is the worst. This first area is the actual worst for mechanics. The Overseer does a terrible ability that they really need to change to not affect enemies. Currently, whenever it does the Wild Wallop, which is just the big circle on the ground, that should just be a dodge, but currently it knocks all enemies to just a billion miles away. Either that needs to be reduced heavily or that just needs to be removed as a mechanic entirely because it is miserable. There is a counterplay to it. If you use a root or a knock or something like that, then you are actually able to prevent the mobs from getting knocked back. So that's not a bad plan. Sorry.
Oh, good.
15 seconds.
Oh, good.
Okay. So yeah, basically not much you can do there to outplay unless you have a root, but you need to do it at the very last second possible. So make sure that you save it until like literally 0.2 seconds before that cast is about to go off, and then boom, root the mobs and they will not get knocked. That being said, just remove it. It's awful. It's a terrible, the mobs here are already terrible enough to group. That is just the worst possible mechanic. I really, really, really don't like that. The counterplay is not fun, and it's just very frustrating to deal with. On top of that, you have the lowly mole herd. You got to make sure you get a kick on the mole frenzy or it's going to pull nearby mobs. That's no fun. And then on top of that, you have the wick lighter, which just needs to be interrupted. The mole herd, one thing to note is that it's just like the mobs at the start of Mists of Tyranid Scythe. At the start of Mists, you have the mobs that would leap out and do the bloodletting bleed, but if you were in melee, they wouldn't even cast it at all. Same thing with this mole herd. That throw rock gets spammed nonstop and does a lot of damage, but if everybody is in melee, it just doesn't cast at all, so it's not even a mob. That being said, obviously it's kind of hard to group sometimes because it just like stands there and throws rock. A lot of times you'll have to move mobs onto it, or you'll have to LOS it, one or the other. In general, though, this first area is just awful because of all these mole herders that don't move, the Overseer that then knocks them 100 yards away, and all these nasty overlaps of throw rocks and the unavoidable AoE. It's not a fun area. So do your best to outplay it in those ways, and otherwise don't get too frustrated when stuff goes awry in this spot. Hopefully Blizzard looks into that a little bit.
Right. First boss, do we need to talk about that, or do you think it's fairly straightforward?
First boss, just kill the minecart when it spawns and make sure that you run your charge into the wall. That's pretty much it. Yep. There's not much to talk about on this boss.
Right.
Next area, force desync. Again, like I was talking about, this is another area similar to the Paladins in Priory, where these wicker light candles do their big AoE, the quenching blast. It is force desynced, so they can never cast at the same time, which means that you can pull as many as you want, as long as your healer can heal your group in between each cast. I like to pull all 3 candles in this room at once. The big thing to look out for is just the Blazing Fiends. Do not pull that top right pack. The one with the 2 Blazing Fiends in the corner, do not pull that. Because if you pull that with everything else, there's going to be too many kicks. They're going to get off, and that's going to increase the damage that you take from the big candles, as well as dealing initial damage to you, which can overlap with the AoE. Just don't worry about them. If you want, you can pull the other 2 Blazing Fiends, which is a lot of count. I like to do every pack in that room at once, except for that one far pack, because it's a pretty easy pull to do as long as your healer can top your group in between the AoE hits, and you can get kicks on the 2 Blazing Fiends, which isn't too bad to manage. That being said, if you're in a pug, I probably wouldn't recommend doing that. That's more of a coordinated environment thing. If you're in a pug, maybe just go for the 2 wicker light candles in the corner with no kick, or you can pull in, that G18 and just handle 1 extra kick, and that should be fine. As for the next 2 rooms, I highly suggest doing an LOS strat for these. These Blazing Fiends are horrible to group and really dangerous when they cast. You can LOS everything though, back out, and they will all gather up and stack in one spot, and then you can use AoE CCs, AoE silences, and just it's way easier to manage. They die significantly faster, and it's much less of a disaster when you do it that way. Same thing for the following pack. G23, all the little flame tenders. I recommend pulling those back into the room, and everybody just sits LOS until they all funnel in, and you can kill them all immediately without too much trouble.
Right. What's going on with the boss?
Yeah. As for the boss, this boss is a unique one. So you want to make sure that you're lighting the candles, and then dousing only 1. So the idea here is that at the start, you're going to get something called Wicker Light Barrage. This is going to basically put debuffs on a few players that is going to make them spawn circles under them, which will light the candles. For this, you always want to light as many candles as possible. So you want each player to have an area of the room that they're assigned to, and then pre-run out, and as soon as they start dropping, go run into as many candles as they can and light as much as they can. Once that's lit, you'll have to do a dodge, and you will get a little bit of AoE damage, followed by the Gust. The Gust, you want to assign 1 spot for everybody to stack, which will blow out 1 singular candle. If you blow out a bunch of candles, you're going to have a terrible time, because you're going to get a big dot that's going to hurt a lot. For each candle that's blown out, the dot increases, so that's why you only want to blow out 1. And then that will be your safe spot that everybody goes to when the fire emerges. And then after that, that's the big like overlap of the fight, where you're gonna get the big AoE damage from Dousing Breath, I think it's called.
Yep.
No, Extinguishing Gust. I don't remember. Enkindling Infernal, something. One of its abilities. It does the big AoE at the same time that you have the dot. That's the dangerous spot for defensives. That's where you want to look as a healer to have throughput. Outside, but it should never be a problem as long as you only get that 1 singular dot. If you're getting a bunch of dots because everybody's blowing out candles, that's a dangerous spot. So I highly recommend placing a marker in front of 1 candle that everybody uses to stack up for when the tornadoes come out, so they can all bait the tornadoes onto 1 candle instead of just baiting them all over the room.
Yep, that's the tip. Let's jump to the third boss, because I know you're running out of time. This is a control fight. What do people kind of need to think about?
Well, really quick, the pack right before that, I just want to mention.
Sure.
The Touch Snarl does the one-handed headlock. That is another mob that can be dodged. So ranged players, if they stay at range, when that mob like jumps out at them, it's going to stun them for 5 seconds, and a frontal's going to hit them. It's very dangerous overlap. So you can actually avoid that entirely by just dodging with movement. So like mages can blink, shamans can gust of wind, druids can wild charge, warlocks can port. You can use a warlock portal, anything at all, any fast movement, even like paladins can just horse. So if you're targeted by the one-handed headlock, be at range and then use a big movement as soon as it goes off on you, and you will never even get the mechanic. And that trivializes that pull significantly. As for the boss, There's only one strat, which is make sure you're stacked every time the Eerie Molds comes out, because the Eerie Molds is going to place things around you that you're going to have to soak, and if you're placing them all spread out across the room, your healer is going to get overwhelmed, because for each one that doesn't get soaked, you are going to take increased damage because each one deals damage to the group. So the idea here is you stack for the Eerie Mold spawns. As soon as they spawn, you want to make sure that any singular mold that's like isolated in an area is the one that you move the pickaxe to, because it throws the pickaxe at somebody, and you want to place a mold in between yourself and the pickaxe. And then you have the circles, which you just want to make sure that you clear the existing molds with those circles. When those circles go off, that's the most dangerous part of the fight defensively. So that's what you want to make sure you use your defensives on. Healers is basically just a rot fight, and as long as you don't fall too far behind, it'll be okay. The only other thing is you have to get the kick. If that kick ever goes off, it is a wipe. You will not live that. It's extremely dangerous. It fears everybody for like 4 seconds, so watch for that. And then immunity classes, be aware that if you press your immunity to try and soak, it will not clear the molds. And that has wiped a lot of groups, because then you just fall way behind on the molds. So if you're going to use your immunity, you should use it right after the molds get cleared to immune the spawn of the new molds and some of the damage that comes from there, which can help your healer out a little bit. But if you're immuning too late before you're clear, and it's not just that your immunity can't be on when it goes off, it can't be on when the circle debuff gets applied to you, because it will actually just make it so that your circle does nothing and doesn't clear them. It's a bit of a bug. I'm hoping they fix that, but for now, definitely be aware of that.
Great advice. What's the fastest way to speedrun the minecart?
There really isn't a way to speedrun. The only thing that you can do to speed up the area is to try and pull ahead, right? So tanks, the biggest thing I can suggest here is when you do the double corridor creeper pull, that's the one that kills tanks a lot, because they get a bunch of stacks. However, keep in mind that you can actually outrun those mobs. And I know that people are scared to outrun them because you go out of there and then you don't receive healing, right? And you have this big nasty dot. However, you can pick up a candle and it lasts 30 seconds and you can just run around with that candle. And you don't actually have to be in the cart to get healing. As long as you're holding a candle, you're fine. You can still get healed. So you can actually be like your own personal mobile cart when you need to kite, just to reset your stacks. Remember, the stacks only last 5 seconds. So at some point, if you just need to, warriors just leap out or whatever it might be, shamans can also reset the stacks by dropping Earth Ellie. There's a lot of different tech that you can do to help your tanks out with resetting their stacks. But at some point during that double corridor creeper pull, you will need to reset your stacks, or you're probably just going to die unless you have like a huge amount of burst damage.
Great tip. Love that you covered the creeper, because that's the most dangerous bit before the last boss as well. The darkness mob, the last boss. Anything you want to call out here in terms of like the candle mechanic and how to do that?
Yeah. So the big thing to look out for on this darkness boss is the AoE. So the AoE is Eternal Darkness. Now during that, it's going to drain the life out of your candle. So 2 things need to happen. 1, you need to make sure that the candle gets filled up right before the Eternal Darkness cast. Not right before, but just a little bit before, like 10 seconds before. And then when the Eternal Darkness cast is casting, you need to assign 1 player to have a candle and be standing outside of the circle, and then about halfway through the Eternal Darkness cast, just walk into the candle and refill it, because that will prevent your candle from ever hitting 0. If your candle hits 0, you start taking a stacking debuff that lasts the entire fight. It's very dangerous. You don't want that to happen. So the best strat is to always make sure you have the candle high energy before that Eternal Darkness goes off, and then you have 1 person assigned to stand with a candle that they pick up outside of the cart right before the Eternal Darkness cast, and then just walk into the candle as soon as the cast is about halfway through done. So that way you never have the candle actually hit 0.
Right. I love the tip. We have 3 remaining dungeons. I know you're short of time. I just want to turn it over to you. Whatever you'd like to call out. I think Workshop, we've seen it for the 3rd time now. But is there any specific call outs you'd like to give for these 3 dungeons?
All right, let's I'll just kind of talk about what changed in these, and just kind of the most dangerous things to look out for. In the first area, you have the hired assassins. Got to get kicks on the toxic blades. And then the Fan of Knives just needs a stop. They will not recast, so you absolutely need to be using stops on the Fan of Knives. That is super, super dangerous. The vendors do Ice Spritzer. You need to make sure you kick. If any of them happen to go off, it's not a huge deal as long as it doesn't go off on your healer, because you can just dispel it. The mech jockeys, you need to make sure that you prevent them from ever activating their mech. In general, that's not too dangerous. Just make sure you use stuns or whatever until they're dead. But they won't even start to run to get to their mech until they're pretty low health anyways. The thugs, you need to look out for the uppercut, which just does a bunch of physical damage to you and knocks you back. You don't want to get knocked back into other packs. In general, the more thugs and peacekeepers that you can avoid in this area, the better. Those are the worst mobs. So try to avoid those as much as you can. The peacekeeper is way more dangerous than it used to be. Now the charge shield does a huge amount of AoE damage to your group. So the big thing to look out for is anytime that your group is taking that charge shield at the same time that other unavoidable damage is going out. That other unavoidable damage could be anything from the Hired Assassin Fan of Knives initial tick before it gets stopped, because it will always do at least 1 tick of damage, even if you're very fast with stopping it, or the thugs with their uppercut. Those are the 2 other unavoidable damage abilities in this area that you need to look out for overlapping with the Peacekeeper, especially on the pole before the boss, which has an Assassin and a Peacekeeper in it. As for the boss, there's literally nothing to talk about. It is the easiest boss on Earth. Just do not miss the kicks. That is the only way you wipe to this boss, is by missing your kicks. If you're trying to min-max your damage, you want to kick in 5 balls immediately, and then hold the 6th ball for as long as you can until the last second, and then kick it in. That's just how you min-max that fight to get the highest uptime on the damage amp. After the boss, you hit the extractors, which just do a big unavoidable AoE. You need to look out for that lining up with any time that the Earthshapers are casting Rock Lance. That Rock Lance hits very hard. You need to make sure you're getting kicks on it. That's just a kick or die type of situation. So not really much to talk about there. That's all just the same trash. It's just kick or die basically for the entirety, all the way up until you get to the mini boss area where you have the Stone Furies. The Stone Furies, a lot of people make the mistake of sending a kick on Tectonic Barrier, which does almost nothing. Do not kick Tectonic Barrier. The only thing you want to kick here is Furious Quake. That will kill your group immediately. Tectonic Barrier does pretty much nothing. Just it's going to put a very small shield, which you can purge, or you can just DPS through, and then you can kick the Furious Quake. Keep in mind that Furious Quake is not kickable while Tectonic Barrier is active, so don't just instantly send your kick when you see the Furious Quake cast. You want to make sure that it's kickable first. The Taskmaster enrages mobs, so you want to look out for when those Earthshapers get enraged. Their Rock Lances cast very quickly. That's pretty much it. Again, same thing, just kick or die. The boss, Azarok, he is very dangerous. This boss used to be a joke, used to really not be that sketchy, and now it is one of the hardest fights in M+. Specifically because the Earth Rager is a little bit overtuned. The pulsing Azurite that the Earth Rager does when enraged hits extremely hard. Now, this did get nerfed, but even post-nerf, it's doing a huge amount of damage, especially because it also applies a big bleed to the tank. So tanks, you need to look out for that. And DPS and healers, DPS, you need to make sure that you're hitting the empowered Azurite or Earth Rager as soon as it gets empowered, and healers, you just need to just be constantly healing because it is a big healing check fight. After you get there, you go down to the weapons testing area. This area is super dangerous. I recommend skipping as much of this as you can. In general, there are specific mobs to look out for. Try and route so that you're never pulling multiple weapons testers at once. The weapon testers are the most dangerous mob here. That's because they cast this Echo Blade, which does a huge amount of damage and cleaves to nearby enemies or allies. So if you are not spread out very well, it's going to cleave a bunch of people and it's going to hurt like hell. The Alchemists don't really do much outside of a Poison Dispel that does a little bit of damage, and then the Transmute, which is just you need to kick it. That's it. Really not that bad, so feel free to pull Alchemists together, but the big rule of thumb, never pull 2 weapons testers at once. As long as you follow that rule, you shouldn't have too bad of a time with any of the pulls in here. that's how you should route that area. Masterminds, just obviously watch out for the person getting sucked by the Mind Lash, and anytime that overlaps with, like them having a poison bleed or something like that. And then obviously you just have to dodge Brainstorm. Then we get to the boss who does nothing. This boss is a complete joke. I don't know why they didn't add a mechanic to it or something. The only person that is not a joke for is the tank. Tanks have a terrible time with this because it doesn't auto attack. Its auto attacks are magic damage, and the magic damage totally messes up a lot of tanks that are heavily reliant on physical DR, like Prot Warriors, for example. So make sure you watch out for your tanks on Rixa. Otherwise, there really isn't much to do. They nerfed the only mechanic of the fight. Not sure why they did that, but they did. So you, as a healer, you really don't have anything to worry about unless people are just bathing in goo. This last area is the most dangerous. So what they did is they made these war machines way harder. These war machines now, with their charge shot, do huge amounts of AoE damage. And I mean like a ridiculous amount of AoE damage. I think it should probably be nerfed. However, it is kind of fun as a healer because it gets dealt in bursts. And especially when you pull two together, it can be very fun. But it's extremely dangerous to pull two together. In general, would never recommend it except when you absolutely have to at the very end, and that should be your lust pull. It's more important to lust that than the boss. Outside of that, it's just, straightforward, dodge, don't get hit by mines, and make sure that you have defensives for the charge shot. Then we get to last boss, and on last boss, not a whole lot to talk about. It's the same as it's always been. Make sure you're in a safe spot. Look out for the intermission. That's the really deadly part of the fight. The intermission is when you'll want your biggest healing cooldowns because you're going to have the unavoidable AoE damage coming from the boss at the same time that the little ads are doing their buster shots, which is just unavoidable single target hits. So look out for that. Make sure that you are you're on top of anybody that's getting targeted by the buster shot at the same time as the AoE, and then just do the boss as normal.
Great, that's Motherlode. Move on to theater if you'd like to cover that. Maybe I know you're running out of time, so feel free to skip as much as you want.
No, it's good. I got enough time to speed run these.
Awesome.
So for theater, the Raging Bloodhorn is a big scary thing trying to do with this first boss. Most groups love to pull this Bloodhorn in. You skip the first 3-pack, and then you do that at the end of the dungeon with Mordretha. It is very efficient to do that. Not all groups can, depending on what you have available for skips. But if you can skip it and pull in the Bloodhorn, then the only thing to keep in mind is you better have a Soothe, and if not, you better have a damn good healer. Or a whole lot of prio damage for that Bloodhorn. Because if that Bloodhorn gets a second Raging Tantrum off without a Soothe, it's going to do a huge amount of AoE damage to your group at the same time that the bosses are also doing AoE mechanics. So definitely look out for that. As for the boss itself, there's only two things to really look out for from a healer perspective. One is Mighty Smash. The Mighty Smash is the big AoE that that Desia does. And then the other one is Searing Death. Searing Death is the big ticking AoE that happens over the course of about 12 seconds. It gets placed on 3 or 4 players, and it does a whole lot of damage. So watch out for Searing Death and watch out for Mighty Smash. Those are the two big AoEs that you need to keep in mind. I highly recommend sending immunities on the Searing Death. And the Searing Death being so dangerous is also why groups should always focus Sathel first. Kill Sathel as fast as you can. You do want to be cleaving, obviously, the other mobs down, but everyone's prio target should be Sathel. The only other thing to keep in mind is Withering Touch. It's going to go out on 2 players. Make sure you dispel one of them. If the other person can dwarf, awesome. Otherwise, just make sure that you send a little bit of targeted healing into them until your second dispel comes back up. Then we're going to drop down. We go into, we'll talk about Zav's area. Zav's area largely unchanged. The only dangerous mob now is actually the mob that used to be the easiest mob in existence. So prior to the changes, Dogig was like the joke mob because he didn't have an AoE. But they added an AoE, and not only did they add an AoE, but they made it so that it's essentially like an instant cast AoE. Whereas all of the other AoEs from the other mini bosses have like a 2 or 3 second cast time, so you have a lot of prep time for it. So if you get Dogig, be hyper aware of when that AoE is coming out, especially if you're pulling in the Arbalest and the Conscripts. If you are pulling that in, which is dangerous, you need to make sure that everybody is killing the Arbalest first. Once it dies, then you can focus the mini-boss. But the Jagged Quirl is the main thing to look out for from the Arbalest. That's what makes this pack so dangerous, as well as the Captain pack in the next area. Those Jagged Quirls are incredibly dangerous and leave a huge bleed on the player. So that's a great spot for Dwarves, Bops, any type of big DR. It's all physical damage, so just keep that in mind. The other mini-bosses, same stuff. Not really much to talk about. You either get an AoE or a targeted bleed, just heal. There used to be meta strats of like lining everything. I don't really think that's going to be a thing. There shouldn't be any need to line those mechanics unless you're doing some crazy pulls, which I don't really recommend. As for the next mini boss, the very last mini boss, you should always skip that. There is pretty much no route where I'd ever recommend not skipping that, and everybody can skip it as long as you place yourself close to the mini boss, but not too close. Quazii, I don't know if you know exactly where it is on the mini map, but there is a specific spot that you can get pretty close to, and then you just all run as a group
I think it's
through
like
that mini boss area.
Yeah, it's like the ridge before the mini boss
Yeah.
area, right? Before you trigger the
Yeah.
RP, yeah.
Yeah, there's a little ridge before the RP triggers and the boss spawns that you can wait, and then as soon as everyone's ready, you just all sprint past the mini boss and up the stairs, and then you're good. Zav, there is literally nothing to talk about from a healer perspective. The meta strat will be to not kill banners, but I do not ever recommend doing that in Pugs. Pugs should always kill the banners. You're going to see high crew groups not kill the banners. That's because it is a waste of damage, but they will always have like complex strats for making sure that they never get hit. Whether it's using freedoms or like warlock portals or mobilities, blinks at the right time, alter time. Every class has a way most every class has a way of dealing with it. And if they don't, some classes have a ways of helping other classes deal with it. So pretty much any meta comp will have a way of making it so that their group doesn't have to kill banners, and that will speed up the boss a lot. That being said, because it's a phasing boss where you constantly have people going down, this is going to be one of the bosses that scales the worst with key level. So it's going to be one of those bosses that you're going to want to send Lust on and try to just kill as fast as you can, because this is where most of your time suck is going to go in higher keys. Then we'll talk about the disease area, the Gore Chop wing. That wing, it's not much to talk about. It's the same as always. The big thing is just looking out for the Withering Discharge kicks from the Blighted Sludge Spewers. That is the only kick that you really have to care about. The rest of them you can defensive and heal through. But if that goes off, you're going to have a terrible time. Make sure that you have those kicks assigned to that ability specifically. Then you've got the Rancid Gas Bags. Those things you should try to skip the patrolling ones if you can. Everybody can do it. It's just a question of whether or not your tank decides to route that. But I highly suggest that everyone take that out of their route. There is one gas bag that's unavoidable, and for that, it's just an AoE ticking damage fight, and you want to watch out for the frontal backle that he does. Not really much to talk about there. Gore Chop is one of those fights that is super easy at lower key levels as long as people dodge the chains, but gets progressively harder and harder and harder the higher key level you go, by like a bigger margin than what other fights scale. It scales much worse because the leaps from the oozing leftovers you can just ignore at low key levels, but then you get to a certain key level where they start one-shotting players if two of them leap on one player at once, and the leaps are constant. So either you need an extremely mobile range class like a BM hunter or something that can just constantly be moving, so because you can actually dodge the leaps out on you, or you need to try to use single target stuns to desync them, or you just need big defensives and to really pay attention to if you see multiple leaps going on you at once. Very difficult fight at higher keys, but pretty easy fight at lower keys. So just something to keep in mind when you're pushing. To go over the Kolthrock wing, Shackled Souls, pretty straightforward. Just they randomly suck players, use AoE stops to make sure that they're not, killing one person too frequently. They can also be pre-freedomed, so that's kind of nice tech for paladins. Portal Guardians are just a big AoE damage, and they will put out Shadow Vulnerability, which increases shadow damage taken on one player. That's just a decurse. Ideally, you have a decurse to get rid of that. If not, that player just needs a big defensive or immunity, or you can use Dwarf to clear it. Bone Maguses are nothing except for just interrupts. All you have to do with these is interrupt the Bone Spear. If you don't interrupt the Bone Spear, you will die. That cast hits unbelievably hard. The big thing, if you're pulling these mobs, you need a Purge to get rid of the initial shield. And then after that, you just have to get AoE, or have to get kicks on the Bone Spear. As long as you get kicks, though, those mobs do literally nothing. Then the Soulbinders, they just do an AoE. That's just kicks. Again, really not much to talk about. That's the entire wing here, is just that. And then the Dark Spear mobs are just big frontal mobs that you just want to look out for the frontal tornado. Really not much to min-max here from a, high key perspective or from a healer perspective. Just make sure you have healing prepped for the Portal Guardian Soulstorm AoE, and that's about all you can do. If casts go off, then so be it. People will die. As for Koltharok, this boss actually got way easier. This boss got infinitely easier because they removed the double dispel mechanic. Now it's just a double dot that goes out that is much more manageable to heal. On top of that, they made it so that all the souls spawn at the back of the wall. So melee players don't need to run back anymore. Now you can stay in melee, but you do still want to make it so that those souls spawn together. So you want to be in a line, like you all want to be in the same quadrant of the room, and ideally stacked in a line. You can be stacked on each other or in a line, it doesn't matter, as long as they're all within the same area. And melee players don't have to leave melee anymore, so that's the good thing. Otherwise, it's just dodge the balls and heal the two players that get the debuff and get your kicks on the boss, and that's it for that fight. As for the last boss, not a whole lot to talk about from Mordretha's POV. It's just, watch out for the Tank Buster on the Reaping Scythe. Watch out for the overlaps. This is just a big overlap fight. There isn't really any singular danger as long as people are getting kicks on the ads that they spawn. The big thing is watching for any time that you get Grasping Rift at the same time as Manifest Death. Those are the two AoEs outside of the intermission phase, which you always, whenever the boss is 50%, you should just have a defensive. But the big overlaps are just going to be any time that you have Grasping Rift and Manifest Death happening together. That's going to be when you want to send your defensive. Outside of that, just watch out for the dodges. You have two separate dodges to look out for, which can overlap. The frontal from Dark Devastation, and then the charges from the ghost mobs at the end. So beware of that. Otherwise, not much to talk about. That boss is pretty straightforward.
Right, and that brings us to the final dungeon workshop. The third time he's coming back, so a lot of the tech has been figured out. They didn't really change a lot of mechanics. Anything you'd like to highlight here?
Well, the changes that they did make, I'm actually a big fan of. First thing in the first poll, I do not suggest pulling it all together in a pug ever. I would split it up to 3 bomb tonks and then 3 bomb tonks. The bomb tonks are all that matters. Nothing else matters. So you just need to make sure that only at the most 1 cast of bomb tonk goes off, never ever 2 at once. And when a cast does get off, you need a big defensive for it. As for the boss changed heavily. This is the biggest boss change, the first boss. This now basically just isn't even a boss for healers anymore. It's mostly just a dodge fight. You just want to dodge the saws, dodge the mines, and look out for the foe flipper knockback, as well as the maximum thrust frontal. All of that is just dodging stuff. Outside of that, there's only one real ability, which is ground pound for healers. And that's just, it doesn't hit hard at all. They nerfed it very, very heavily. So now it's just a pretty light heal. So I'm not really going to talk about much on that first boss. Everyone should know how to do that. It's a pretty straightforward boss. I do want to talk about the next area, though. The next area is crazy for healers. It's a lot of fun, actually. The metal gunks do this thing called corrosive gunk, which applies big healing absorbs, and the waste processing units do mega drill. Now, the big thing to look out for is anytime those two happen at the same time, and that will happen almost every time. So you have 2 options. Either 1, your healer has an absolutely huge amount of throughput and tells you don't CC, or 2, your healer doesn't have a lot of throughput and says delay the metal gunks until after the waste processing unit. In a pug, you should always look to delay the metal gunks till after the waste processing unit does its mega drill. That way, you're not taking AoE damage during the healing absorb, because that combo is what's going to kill you. So highly suggest using CC, AoE stuns, blinds, whatever, to delay those gunks from casting until after the mega drill goes off. Outside of that, the dogs are the really dangerous thing in this area. You have 3 metal dogs, or you have 10 metal dogs that all put out nasty debuffs. Do not pull these all together. You will die guaranteed. I recommend splitting it up into at least 2 pulls, and ideally you don't even pull all of them. I think the best way to do it is to skip 3 of those dogs and instead just pull 4 dogs into 3 dogs. The most I'd ever pull in a pug would be 4 dogs. Pulling more than that is probably just death, because the healer simply does not have enough dispels and the dot hits incredibly hard. This can be immuned, it can be dwarfed. You should be using all of that for your healer. Just pay attention to whether or not they have dispelled or not, because if you dwarf a dispel, your healer is going to be very sad. As for the boss, I assume that you will have a weak aura linked for people, but everybody knows about the Kujo weak aura, and if you don't, you're missing out. You need the Kujo weak aura. Make sure that you have it. It is a giant thing that pops up on your screen when you're supposed to hide that says you are safe. And if you're safe, then you're good. If you don't see that weak aura, you better be hiding. Now, there is stuff to min-max with LOS where you can actually be on the side of the box, and technically LOS, you will have the buff even while hitting the boss and not being LOS from it. That is what people use to min-max the Venting Flames, is that weak aura. So definitely get that weak aura and make sure that you have it. Outside of that, not much to talk about on that boss. Just make sure you're spreading. And if you really want to save your team a little bit as a hunter or a mage or somebody with shadow meld, you can be max range, or you can be the furthest person out when he does the explosive leap. And if you're targeted, when he jumps on you, just press your invis or your feign or your shadow meld right as soon as his cast finishes, right as he's about to like leap towards you. And as soon as the cast finishes, if you press it right then, it will cancel all of the jumps. So it's a nice way to save your healer, but not necessary. Then you go through the little thing and you come up to the Mechagon area with the guards and the Mechagon tinkers. And this is just get kicks and dodge squirrels, not anything to talk about. The next pull, however, the second RP pull, is the defense spots. Those defense spots put out really nasty dots, and if you have one of those dots, when the short out unavoidable AoE starts to happen, you need a huge defensive or you will die. Healers, you want to dispel the first person immediately, and then hopefully one of the next 2 people has either dwarf or an immunity or something to clear it, so that you only really ever have one person with the dot. And if you're fast enough with your first dispel, you can get a second dispel on one of the players right before the short out, and that is what I suggest doing. In general, though, this is kind of a group thing. Healers can only heal so much. If you have that dot during the AoE, you absolutely need to help. As for the Blasteron, they only added one thing, which is that now it does a little bit of pulsing AoE, which is nice for the healer. Gives us a little something to do. Doesn't hit too hard. It's just a little bit of rot fight, so try to enjoy that. Then you have the maze, which is the hardest part of the dungeon. It screws my pugs every time, including myself. But obviously, you know, I'm not going to really talk about that because I just would rather that people don't know how to do it so I can get more clips for stream.
Fair enough.
No, I mean, there's not really like a meta strat to that. Just dodge and walk through. As for the next pull, you want to use the defender's shields that they put up to DR yourself. It gives you 75% DR. You can get hit by a squirrel in there and live, but in general, I probably suggest moving out anytime the squirrels are happening, especially because the shield can despawn right as the squirrel is going off. So if you're not tracking the shield's duration with some sort of weak aura or something, you can get screwed by that overlap. Outside of that, not really much to talk about. Just get kicks on the tune-ups and the Giga Zap thing, whatever it's called, Giga Wallop. And then just use the defense matrix for the AoEs. And just in general, just stand in them in case casts go off on you. Boss, literally nothing to talk about. Just dodge, get good. That's it. There's no strat to this. Kill the ad when it spawns and just dodge. There is a spot you can stand on the stairs as a ranged. In general, I wouldn't suggest it in most cases because I have watched a lot of ranged die to it because they still get hit by the fiery beam on the steps. So you have to like run in for the fiery beam, then run back out to the steps to be safe. You can do it though if you want. You can play around with it. You are safe from the cogs on the stairs. So that's why people like it. As for the spider tanks, this is what changed the most in this dungeon. These things are horrifying. These things do an immense amount of damage. It is constant AoE damage. It requires upwards of 4 million HPS on higher keys if you're pulling both of these at once. If your healer is not confident or doesn't have huge CDs, don't pull them both at once. Just pull them one at a time. It'll be okay. You'll probably still time your key. It's not a huge time loss. If your healer is a Chad though and just has like a billion healing, fucking do it and have fun. And it's a huge amount of rot healing. So make sure that you're aware of the dangers if you decide to do that. As for the next part, same thing, same exact thing that I talked about. The big thing that I want to mention is just skip these last 2 packs. Don't pull them. Your healer will hate you. Your DPS will hate you. Your tank will hate you. I don't know who's in charge here of making this route, but do not do it. The best way to skip this is you have a tank pull the mobs all the way to the corner of the room, and then everyone just runs by. The tank will need to get a kick on one of the tinkerers. But assuming that they can do that, everybody should have enough room to squeeze through. When you do that death skip, you need to be aware that the mechanical squirrels will still run at you. That will be fake combat. So it will put you in combat and you will have to dodge it, but you will not pull the mobs. So yeah, just keep that in mind. If you do have to pull this for any reason, you're not feeling confident in the death skip, whatever it might be, the big thing to keep in mind is if you can CC that top defender in group 25, you can pull down the defense bots into this and you'll always have a defender active. The big thing is just making sure you always have a shield up. If you have a shield up, the pull isn't too bad. If you don't have a shield up, you're going to have a terrible time. So if you CC one of the defenders, then when you're AoEing all these mobs down and one of the defenders dies, you can pull in the other defender and get a new shield. That way you always have a shield for the whole pull. As for the last boss, this boss is basically just make sure that you dodge the balls that reposition, and then make sure that you are using defensives for the Mega Zap. For higher keys and super crazy strats, you are actually able to do a taunt swap mechanic where you can force the Mega Zap to always go on the tank. You do that by taunting right before he's about to cast Mega Zap, then halfway through the Mega Zap cast, like right as it's about to go off, the tank taunts back, and it will force the Mega Zap to go onto the tank. Now, I do not recommend doing this in any situation other than extremely high keys where it's actually required because people are getting one shot without it, and you're in a super coordinated environment. It's just something that I'll mention because you'll probably see it if you're watching higher key players do it occasionally. As for the main boss, do not try taunting the main boss. Once he's phased, he will melee you and he will absolutely wreck your days. So do not try that once he's in phase 2. That's only a phase 1 thing. For phase 2, the best strat as a melee is play max melee range, and anytime the recalibrate happens, walk into melee. Then as soon as they recalibrate, walk back out to max melee. And you just do that over and over again. You will never have to worry about, the things dodging back and forth, whatever it might be. You will always be 100% safe. You just need to make sure that everybody is doing it with you. If you have other melee that are not doing it, you're going to have a bad time. So in coordinated groups, play max melee, and then just walk in anytime that they recalibrate, and then walk back out before the next recalibrate bait. As for ranged, just make sure you're not outranging your healer and make sure you're not playing too far to the left or right side of the room, because if you do and a melee is in the front left or right side of the room, you actually won't see their arrows, and that has wiped our group before. So got to be careful for that. The Magneto arm, they actually just removed a mechanic from. It no longer sucks. So that is actually kind of a really great change. But I almost ran off the edge because of it, because I was expecting the pullback. And so I was standing right by the edge, and I was expecting the suck in to happen, and I started moving forward, and it didn't happen, and I almost just ran straight off the edge. So be aware that Magneto arm no longer sucks you back. And so you don't need to worry about fighting that with moving forward. The main thing to look out for as a healer here is just the Mega Zap. Obviously, 3 of them are going to go out. If you have an immunity, you can send it right before it hits you, and you can actually get targeted by multiple. So like Paladins can bubble, and if they're lucky enough, they can bubble all 3 of the Mega Zaps if they bubble the first one very late into the cast. If you have invis or aggro drops like Shadow Meld, stuff like that, Feign Death, you can remove the Mega Zap from you and it will not recast. So that's another good thing. And that's pretty much it. Otherwise, just make sure that you have big dots. And remember that the Magneto arm does fall off damage. So make sure that you're aware of where the magnet gets thrown during the Magneto arm phase, and that you run into melee and you want to be on the side that the magnet isn't. So if the magnet is on the left side, you want to be front right. Because it does significant fall off damage. So the further away from it you are, the less damage you're going to take.
And that pretty much is the entire of Workshop. I'll just add one thing. I've died to playing a Demon Hunter and doing the hunt on the boss in the second phase, and you'll fall off the platform. I don't know when Blizzard will fix that, because the hitbox is really big, but somehow the hunt just connects with the center of the hitbox. So just warning, they might fix it down the road. But, you know, as you were just kind of going off on your kind of speed run, you know, I was just sitting there and just thinking like, these are super helpful, but I think what is more impressive to people is, you know, I think you have this dogged determination to cover everything that is helpful and important to people, even though you're kind of short on time. And I think people really love you for the 2 episodes you did previously because of that. And, you know, just like you sipping water and stuff, people know that, like, you know, it's tiring, right, to go through this. But I think a heartfelt thank you. I think
my voice hurts.
Yeah,
I think it's
know,
gone.
dude. Like, I feel it. I actually feel sorry for you for, you know, having to go through in such excruciating detail. But I can almost imagine like this will save so many brick keys down the road. So I hope so. I'm sure like that kind of like gratitude will come back to your stream and whatnot. Which reminds me, everything will be plugged in the description. This will be, I believe, jointly posted on your channels as well. But more importantly, I think, you know, it's just amazing to hear you be so passionate about Mythic Plus after so many years. You've been competing in this game over so many years, and yet you're still so passionate. I think like that's something that beyond all these tech that you just taught us, it's just a reminder that we are all students of this game and there's still so much that we can learn. But you know, I don't want to take up more time than the 2.5 hours you spent just kind of breaking down everything for us. This is truly like, you know, it's like college lecture worthy kind of like class.
I warned you I was gonna do this. I remember.
Yeah,
at the start of this,
really a warning.
before we started,
I feel bad, dude. I literally feel bad. Like, I know you're tired, and
before we started, you were like, "Let's limit this to like an hour." I'm like, "Yeah, that's not gonna happen."
Yeah, the limit to hours.
I know I'm gonna rant.
Not so much me, because I will sit here and listen to you all day. But it's really more like I just feel sorry for your voice, dude. I hope you get some good rest. But that said, I also want to turn it over to you and just see like if you have any last shout outs. Obviously, this is a monumental effort from you, like every season, and we'll keep doing it as much as like you like it or you can still do it. But I'd like to turn it over to you. Any last shout outs, any last thoughts here before we wrap up? I
think my biggest shout out is to Blizzard. This season owns incredible changes, top to bottom. Visual changes are a billion out of 10. So good. The visual changes and clarity on dodgeable mechanics is night and day. It makes the game a lot more fun. And on top of that, I think that these dungeons are just incredibly well designed. So big shout out to Blizzard. Really, really good changes. Oh, and then the depletion thing. Really, really smart the way they implemented that, because I was worried that they were going to go way too far one way or the other. And I think this is a great middle ground that will make pushing keys a lot healthier for the community and feel a lot better and cut down on a lot of frustrations and toxicity that comes with pushing. So huge fan of everything that they've done this season. Really looking forward to the season. I think it's going to be one of the best in M+ history.
Right. I want to echo what Ellesmere said there. I think I was telling him before we started recording that I played keys for like 18 hours in a day and I still feel really fresh. Like, it's just a breath of fresh air to know that the difficulty curve is kind of very tightly tuned in the first 2 weeks. Secondly, I think, like he mentioned, Dungeon Pool is fun. But I think thirdly, it's really fun to play alts right now because it's so much easier to gear up versus Season 1. So, I guess Blizzard really kind of like nailed the start of the season. Hopefully, the rest of the season continues to see a lot of attention from them. But I think we're in it for a banger of a season. With that said, Ellesmere, I just want to say thank you again. It's been really long, an episode. I just want to say thank you again. Please get some rest. And naturally, I personally will try and make sure that this episode gets sent to my editor ASAP so you can also post it. That's the least we can do. So that's it. I just want to say thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. I always love it. And looking forward to the next one.
Likewise. Thanks, Ellesmere. See you soon. Take care.
All right.
GGs.
See you soon.
See you.